She tore the invoice in half without reading past the first line. 32 years old, standing in a hangar that smelled like grease, and 4 months of his life, Mason Ryder watched the woman in the tailored blazer drop the pieces onto the concrete floor like they were garbage. Security was already moving toward him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He reached into his jacket, set a sealed envelope on the workbench beside the helicopter he'd bled to restore, and said 7 words. "You have 24 hours to decide." Then he walked out. Neither of them knew that Invoice was the least dangerous thing in that hangar. Before we go further, if you've ever been cheated out of something you earned or watched someone destroy the wrong person, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's go. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, and Mason almost didn't answer it. He was elbow deep in the engine compartment of a Bell 407 that belonged to a medevac company out of Phoenix, his phone buzzing on the workbench beside a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. His daughter Lily was in the back office doing homework. She was 9, and on days when school let out early and his neighbor couldn't watch her, she came to the shop with him. She'd claimed the rolling stool near the parts cabinet as her personal throne and spent most afternoons drawing horses in her notebook or arguing with fractions. "Dad," she called out, "your phone's going crazy. Let it go. It's the same number 3 times. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already past the point of usefulness and picked up the phone. Unknown number, Houston area code. He almost set it back down. "Ryder Aviation Maintenance." "Is this Mason Ryder?" A woman's voice. Sharp. The kind of voice that was used to people saying yes quickly. "That's me. My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm the CEO of Sterling Aero Group. I was given your name by Gerald Pham at Southwest Regional Aviation. He said you might be able to help me with a restoration project." Mason leaned against the workbench and looked up at the fluorescent light that had been flickering for 3 weeks. He kept meaning to replace it. "Gerald's a good guy," Mason said. "What kind of restoration?" "An Airbus H175, 2019 model. It sustained significant damage 18 months ago. Rotor system, transmission deck, hydraulic lines, partial airframe compromise on the port side. 3 major repair centers have already assessed it. All 3 declined the contract." He let that land for a second. "They declined it. They said the damage profile made restoration economically non-viable. And you're calling me because Gerald said you restored an EC-135 that 2 facilities had already written off. He said if anyone could tell me whether the H175 is actually beyond saving or whether those companies were just protecting their own schedules, it would be you." Mason walked to his office doorway and looked in at Lily, who was now chewing on her pencil eraser and staring at her homework like it had personally wronged her. She glanced up, made a face, held up her math worksheet. He gave her a thumbs up. He didn't entirely mean. "What's your timeline?" he asked. "Aggressive. I need the aircraft airworthy within 4 months. There's a merger negotiation that depends on the fleet being at full operational capacity. 4 months on an H175 with that damage profile is ambitious, I know. Gerald said you don't take jobs for the money." Mason laughed despite himself. "Gerald needs to stop telling people that. I take jobs for the money. I just don't take jobs I can't finish." There was a pause on her end, shorter than he expected. "Can you fly to Houston and assess it this week?" He looked back at Lily, at the fractions worksheet, at the drawing of a horse that had too many legs but a lot of heart. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." Houston in October still felt like someone had left the oven on. Mason landed at Hobby on a Thursday morning, picked up a rental car and drove 40 minutes northwest to the Sterling Aero Group facility, which occupied a sprawling campus of hangars and administrative buildings on the edge of a regional airfield. The perimeter fence was clean, the signage was new, and there was a security checkpoint at the main gate with a guard who actually checked his ID against a visitor log before letting him through. First impressions? Money, process, the appearance of competence. The H175 was in Hangar 4. He smelled it before he fully saw it. That particular combination of metal fatigue, hydraulic fluid, and the faint ghost of a fire that had been put out but not forgotten. The helicopter sat in the middle of the hangar floor like a patient in a hospital bed, surrounded by scaffolding on the port side, and covered in examination marks from the previous assessment teams. Blue tape everywhere, sticky notes, a rolling whiteboard covered in diagrams that someone had partially erased. Mason set his bag down and walked around it slowly. He didn't say anything for almost 4 minutes. A man in his late 40s appeared from the back of the hangar, stocky, florid complexion, the kind of handshake that was meant to establish dominance before anything else was established. He wore a button-down with the Sterling logo on the chest. "You must be Ryder. I'm Dennis Cahill, Director of Maintenance Operations." He said it the way people say titles when titles are all they have. "Ms. Sterling asked me to show you around." "I'm fine on my own," Mason said. Not rude, just clear. Cahill smiled with his mouth. "Of course. I'll be at the workbench if you have questions." Mason crouched under the nose of the helicopter and started at the beginning. But the H-175 was bad. That part the other companies had gotten right. The rotor mast had taken stress damage that rippled down into the main gearbox housing. The hydraulic lines on the port side had been improperly patched by someone at some point. Emergency field repair, it looked like, done quickly and without the right fittings. 2 of the transmission mounting bolts showed cracking consistent with metal fatigue from vibration they should never have been absorbing. The airframe compromise on the left rear quarter panel was more extensive than the assessment reports had described, but the other companies had stopped there. Mason didn't. He spent 3 hours going through the aircraft. He pulled inspection panels that the other teams hadn't touched, ran his fingers along joints and seams, checked the wiring harnesses, examined the fuel system routing, checked serial numbers against the maintenance log that Cahill had left in a binder on the workbench. It was during this last part that he felt the first small wrongness. It was nothing obvious, just a component number that didn't match what the log said should be there. One number on a hydraulic pressure sensor, a part so ordinary it barely registered. He wrote it down in the small notebook he carried everywhere, the same brand of black moleskin he'd been buying for years, a habit he'd picked up in the Army when documentation was the difference between a signed-off aircraft and a lawsuit. He noted it, thought nothing more about it, and kept going. Well, by the time Victoria Sterling arrived at the hangar, it was past 2 in the afternoon. Mason had his jacket off and was on his back under the tail section when he heard her heels on the concrete. He slid out and stood up. She was taller than her voice had suggested, maybe 5'9", dark hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who'd given up on it looking casual, sharp cheekbones, a navy blazer over a white shirt. She looked like the cover of a magazine about women who didn't need magazines to tell them what to do. She looked at the state of him. Grease on his forearms, dust on his jeans, and her expression didn't change. "Mr. Ryder." "Miss Sterling." "What's your assessment?" He liked that she didn't waste time on small talk. He also noticed that Cahill had drifted back toward them without being asked. "It's repairable," Mason said. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite relief. More like a person allowing themselves to sit down after standing for a long time. "How confident are you?" "Confident enough to take the contract. There's a lot of work here that the other teams probably didn't want to deal with. The transmission housing is going to require machined replacement components that aren't stock, and the hydraulic line rerouting on the port side means pulling apart systems that were patched incorrectly at some point." He glanced at Cahill. "Before my time." Cahill's expression didn't change. "We had a field incident 14 months ago. The ground crew handled immediate safety protocols." "Sure," Mason said, in a tone that didn't agree but didn't push. "Not yet." Victoria was watching him. 4 months? Can you actually do it?" "If I have full access to the maintenance records, unrestricted access to the aircraft and surrounding documentation, and a contract that lets me stop work if I find something that changes my assessment, yes, 4 months." She nodded once. "I'll have legal send you a contract tonight. Cahill will coordinate hangar access." She started to leave, then turned back. "Gerald Pham said you were in the Army. Helicopter maintenance?" 8 years, 3 overseas rotations." "What made you leave?" Mason looked at the helicopter. "My daughter was born," he said. "I wanted to be there." Victoria Sterling studied him for a moment like she was deciding something. Then she nodded again and walked out. Cahill watched her go, then turned back to Mason with that same broad smile. She's particular, Cahill said. We all just try to keep things running smoothly. I appreciate that, Mason said. I work better when things are running smoothly too. He said it pleasantly. But he wrote Cahill's name in his moleskin that evening, under the component number that hadn't matched. He relocated to Houston the following week. Lily was not thrilled about this. She handled it the way 9-year-olds handle most things they don't like. Complete theatrical devastation followed by surprising pragmatism once the initial storm passed. She'd stay with Mason's sister Deb in San Antonio, 2 hours away. Deb had a dog, a trampoline, and absolutely no homework enforcement policy, which Lily correctly identified as a significant lifestyle upgrade. "You'll call me every night?" Lily said at the airport, holding his hand with one hand and her stuffed rabbit with the other. The rabbit's name was Sergeant. She'd named it at age 4 during his last deployment, and had never seen any reason to change it. "Every night, 7 o'clock. What if you forget?" "I won't forget." "You forgot last time." He had. A bad day in the shop, he'd lost track of time, and by the time he remembered it was 9:30 and she was already asleep. He'd felt like garbage about it for a week. "I won't forget this time," he said. She looked at him with the specific kind of skepticism that 9-year-olds aim at their parents. The look that says, "I love you, but I'm keeping records." Then she hugged him hard around the middle and walked through security with Deb, looking back twice. He stood at the window until they disappeared around the corner. Then he drove back to Houston and went to work. The first 2 months were the kind of work Mason understood. Brutal, technical, satisfying in the way that only genuinely hard things can be. He worked 10, 12, sometimes 14-hour days. He sourced the machine transmission housing components from a specialist manufacturer in Wichita, had the hydraulic lines fully rerouted using OEM specifications, replaced the compromised frame section on the port side with new airframe material that he had certified himself. He called Lily every night at 7. He missed twice. He felt terrible both times. He also kept finding things. The second wrong component number appeared in week 3 on a tail rotor actuator. Small thing, easy to miss. The number was close, just a few digits off, but Mason had rebuilt enough of these systems that he recognized it the way you recognize a wrong note in a familiar song. He pulled the component, examined it, compared it to the manufacturer specification in the parts database. The dimensions were correct, the function was correct, but the serial number didn't trace back to the original manufacturer. It traced back to a supplier he'd never heard of. He noted it, ordered a replacement from the certified supplier, said nothing yet. In week 5, he found 3 more. That was when he stopped treating it as coincidence. He went back through the maintenance logs more carefully this time, cross-referencing component serial numbers against the manufacturer databases he had access to through his FAA certification. What he found was not a pattern of mistakes. Mistakes are random. This was consistent. Components that looked right were installed correctly, performed adequately in short-term testing, but whose paper trail dissolved under scrutiny into supplier names and certification numbers that either didn't exist or belonged to aircraft he'd never touched. That last part took him a moment to process. His own certification number, the FAA mechanic certificate number that appeared on every maintenance record he signed, appeared on records for aircraft he had never inspected. 14 of them. Spread across the Sterling Fleet maintenance logs over a period of 22 months. Someone had been forging his signature. Not his actual signature, but his certification number, used as authorization on maintenance approvals he'd never given, on aircraft he'd never seen. He sat in his car in the parking lot of the hotel for 40 minutes that night. He called Lily at 7:04. She told him about the dog. He laughed at the right moments. After he hung up, he sat in the dark for another hour, thinking through what he knew, what he could prove, and what it meant. Then he called his old Army buddy, a man named Rex Whitmore, who now worked as an aviation safety consultant and had spent 3 years as an FAA compliance investigator before going private. Rex answered on the second ring. "Mason, what time is it?" "Late. I've got a situation." He heard Rex sit up in bed. "Talk to me." Mason talked. Rex listened. When Mason finished, Rex was quiet for a moment. How much documentation do you have? Rex asked. Photographs of every component I've replaced, copies of the maintenance logs I've been reviewing, my own inspection notes, the serial number discrepancies I've traced. Save everything, hard copies, cloud backup, email yourself the originals. Don't say anything to Sterling or her people yet. I wasn't planning to. Good. And Mason, be careful. This isn't a paperwork error. If someone's been using your certification number on fraudulent approvals across a whole fleet, they've got reasons to keep it quiet. I know. You carrying? This is a work site, Rex. That's not what I asked. Mason said nothing. Be careful, Rex said again. The bribe came in week 7. Cahill invited him to lunch, a barbecue place 3 miles from the facility, good enough food that Mason spent the first 15 minutes being almost lulled into thinking it was just lunch. Then Cahill ordered a second beer, leaned back in the booth, and set a folder on the table between them. We've been really impressed with your work on the H-175, Cahill said. I appreciate that. Ms. Sterling is pleased with the progress reports. He pushed the folder forward slightly, not quite offering it, not quite leaving it alone. We've been discussing adding a consulting role. Long-term, fleet maintenance oversight, quarterly inspections, full contract. He named a number. It was a good number. It was the kind of number that would make Lily's college fund look completely different. Mason looked at the folder. That sounds like a job offer. Call it an investment in a relationship that's working well. And in exchange for this investment, Cahill smiled. The remaining restoration items on the H-175, we have some internal deadlines. There are a few components where we might be able to use the existing parts if they're rated as functionally adequate, rather than pulling full replacement on everything. Mason kept his face neutral with the practice of a man who'd sat in front of Army officers during difficult briefings. Which components? He asked. Cahill named 2 of them. They were both components Mason had already flagged for replacement, not because they were catastrophically failed, but because their paperwork trail was wrong, their provenance was questionable, and in aviation, questionable provenance was the same as unacceptable. I'd need to review them, Mason said. Of course. Of course. Cahill smiled again. We're not asking you to cut corners, just to apply some professional judgment about what's truly necessary versus what's a best-case scenario in a perfect world. Mason picked up his sweet tea, took a drink, set it back down. Dennis, he said, how long have you been in this industry? Cahill blinked. 23 years. Then you know that the difference between functionally adequate and airworthy in a main rotor system component is the difference between a helicopter landing and a helicopter not landing. The smile didn't go away, but it changed quality, got thinner. Nobody wants any problems, Cahill said. Least of all Ms. Sterling. Then help me finish the job right, Mason said. That's the only thing I'm interested in. He paid for his own lunch on the way out. That evening, he photographed the maintenance records he'd been compiling, backed everything up to 2 separate cloud accounts, and emailed encrypted copies to Rex Whitmore. He didn't tell Victoria Sterling about the lunch. Not yet. He needed more. He got more in week 9. He'd been cross-referencing supplier invoices against parts manifests, tedious work, the kind that made his eyes go blurry after 2 hours, when he found a vendor called Apex Aviation Components, LLC. The company appeared frequently in Sterling's accounts, 47 separate invoices over 18 months, totaling just over $2.3 million in parts purchases. The parts were categorized as routine maintenance components, filters, seals, sensors, actuators. Mason ran the company name through the FAA supplier database, then through the state business registry, then through a commercial business search tool Rex had licensed him access to. Apex Aviation Components, LLC, had been registered in Delaware 14 months ago. It had no physical address beyond a registered agent's office. It had no FAA parts manufacturer approval. It had no distributor approval. It had, as far as Mason could determine, no actual inventory, no employees, and no facility. It was a ghost. $2.3 million had been paid to a ghost, and some of the parts it had theoretically supplied were installed in aircraft that Mason had found carrying his forged certification number. He sat back from the maintenance binder and looked at the ceiling of the hangar for a long time. Somewhere above him, one of the overhead lights hummed at a frequency that matched the ringing in his ears that he'd had since an incident during his second deployment. A near miss with a tail rotor on an LZ that nobody in his unit ever talked about anymore. He thought about Lily, about Sergeant the Rabbit, about the look on her face when she'd hugged him at the airport. He thought about the helicopter he was sitting in the shadow of, restored now to a condition that was actually better than its original factory spec in several areas, because Mason didn't know how to do anything partially. He thought about Cahill's smile over the barbecue. He thought about whoever had put his certification number on 14 aircraft he'd never seen. He pulled out his notebook and kept writing. The restoration was completed on a Friday in late February. Mason had beaten the 4-month deadline by 6 days, which said something about what he was capable of when he had his jaw set about something. The H-175 was, in his professional assessment, airworthy, not just minimally airworthy, genuinely, fully, inspected at every level airworthy. He had documented every component he'd installed, every system he'd serviced, every discrepancy he'd found and corrected. 347 pages of inspection records with photographs. He also had a second file. This one was 79 pages. It contained the fraudulent component serial numbers, the Apex Aviation Ghost Company documentation, the supplier invoice trail, the 14 maintenance records bearing his forged certification number, records of the attempted bribe, and cross-referenced analysis connecting all of it to a pattern that had been running inside Sterling Aero Group for at least 22 months. He had organized this second file with the same meticulous care he'd applied to the restoration itself, and it was arguably better documentation than anything the original investigators would produce, because Mason had the technical knowledge to explain what he was looking at in terms that would hold up under scrutiny. He prepared his invoice. Parts, labor, certification fees, specialist manufacturing costs. He itemized everything. He checked the numbers 3 times, then had Rex review it for anything that looked inflated. It wasn't inflated. If anything, Rex said, it was 10% under market for the complexity of the job. Mason printed 2 copies, sealed one in an envelope, and drove to the facility. The meeting was in the main conference room adjacent to Hangar 1, the kind of room that had been designed to impress clients, all glass and brushed steel, and a table that seated 20. Victoria Sterling sat at the head of the table. Cahill sat to her left. 2 people Mason didn't recognize, lawyers, he guessed, from the way they held their pens like weapons, sat along one side. Mason sat down alone on the other side with a folder containing the invoice. He slid it across the table. Victoria opened it. He watched her face as she read. He'd known the number was large. The work had been enormous, and the parts costs alone were well into 6 figures. But he'd expected her to ask questions. Maybe push back on a line item or 2. That was normal. That was how professional transactions worked. He was not prepared for what she actually did. She got about 1/3 of the way down the first page. Then she picked up the invoice and tore it in half. The sound was extraordinarily loud in the silent room. "This is unconscionable," she said. Her voice was cold and controlled in the way that meant the cold and control were costing her something. "These figures are inflated by at minimum 40%. You've been in our facility for 4 months and you think we don't have the ability to verify these costs?" Mason felt the heat move through him. Not anger exactly, something older and quieter, the feeling of having been in enough situations where being right didn't matter. And he let it pass. "The parts invoices are all documented," he said. "Every line item has a receipt. We have our own internal cost assessments. Our procurement team has indicated these figures. I'd be interested in knowing who provided those assessments," Mason said. She stopped. Something moved behind her eyes. A hesitation. Gone in a second. "Mr. Ryder," said one of the lawyers, "Sterling Aero Group reserves the right to dispute any invoice that appears inconsistent with industry standard pricing." "Sure," Mason said. He stood up. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the sealed envelope. He set it on the table. "You have 24 hours, he said, "both to verify the invoice and to decide what you want to do." "What's in the envelope?" Victoria asked. "Something you should read," Mason said. "Alone." He looked at Cahill when he said the word alone. Cahill's eyes for just a moment went somewhere else. Mason turned to Victoria. He studied her face, Not her title, not her blazer, not the way she held herself in a room built to establish authority. Just her face. She was under an enormous amount of pressure. He could see it. She was trying to close the most important deal of her career, and she'd been told, by people she trusted, people she'd paid, people she relied on, that the helicopter was done, and the mechanic was overcharging her. She believed them. He almost felt sorry for her. "Ms. Sterling," he said, "I didn't come here for a fight. I came here to return your aircraft in better condition than it's ever been in. Everything I charged you for, I did. Read the envelope." He buttoned his jacket. The security guard appeared at the conference room door, called, he suspected, by someone at the table while he'd been talking. Mason looked at the guard's shoes, then up at his face. Young guy, just doing his job. "I know where the exit is," Mason said. "I'll see myself out." He walked out of the conference room, through the hangar, past the H-175 that he'd spent 4 months putting back together. He didn't look at it as he passed. He didn't need to. He knew what he'd done. Outside, the Houston afternoon smelled like asphalt and jet fuel and the particular dryness that comes before evening. He got in his rental car. He drove back to the hotel. He called Lily at exactly 7 o'clock. "Dad?" she said immediately. "Deb's dog ate my math worksheet." He laughed. It was real. He'd needed it. "Is that why you didn't turn it in?" "I'm going to tell Mrs. Patterson that." "How about you just redo it, Dad?" "Lily." She sighed with her whole body, the way she always did. And for a few minutes in a hotel room in Houston, nothing else existed except his daughter's voice telling him about a dog named Biscuit who had, apparently, very poor taste in snacks. After they hung up, he sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. He'd delivered the invoice. He'd left the envelope. He'd given her the chance. What happened in the next 24 hours wasn't in his hands anymore. He opened his laptop, checked that the backup files were secure, and went to bed. He slept badly, but he slept. The morning after Mason walked out of the Sterling conference room, he woke up at 5:47 a.m. without an alarm, the way he always did when something was sitting wrong in his chest. The hotel room was dark except for the light bleeding under the curtains from the parking lot outside. He lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of an aircraft somewhere over Houston beginning its descent. He'd given her the envelope. He'd given her 24 hours. He got up, made bad hotel coffee, and sat at the small desk with his laptop open. He checked his secure cloud folder. Everything was still there, intact, 79 pages of documentation he hoped Victoria Sterling would never need to see in a courtroom, but suspected she might. He checked his phone. No calls. No messages from the Sterling offices. He showered, put on the same kind of clothes he always wore to work, dark jeans, a worn canvas shirt, boots that had been resoled twice, and drove to a diner 2 miles from the hotel because he'd been eating there most mornings for the past 3 weeks, and the woman who worked the counter knew he wanted his eggs over medium without him having to say it. Her name was Paulette. She was in her 60s, moved like her knees hurt, and had the specific efficient warmth of someone who'd been feeding people for decades and had made peace with the fact that most of them wouldn't remember her name. "You look like you slept in a parking lot," she said, filling his coffee without being asked. "I slept fine." "Uh-huh." She looked at him with the frank assessment of someone who had no particular investment in his feelings. "You want toast?" "Yeah." "You should eat more than eggs and toast." "I know. So there's a country skillet that'll fix what's wrong with you." "Nothing's wrong with me." She gave him a look that said, "Sure, honey," and walked back to the counter. He appreciated her. She didn't push. He ate his eggs. He drank his coffee. He thought about the envelope. Inside it were 14 pages, not the full 79, just the most critical subset. The forged certification numbers. The ghost company. A brief written summary of the fraudulent component trail, cross-referenced with dates and aircraft registration numbers. Enough that any competent person could see what it pointed toward. Enough that Victoria Sterling, if she was the kind of person Mason was beginning to think she might be underneath all that corporate armor, would understand that the problem in her company wasn't an overpriced invoice. The question was whether she'd open it before she made a decision, or after. He was back at the facility by 8. Not because he had worked there, his contract was technically in dispute, but because the H-175 was still his responsibility in a professional sense until someone officially accepted or rejected the invoice. And he wasn't the kind of man who walked away from an aircraft he'd certified without making sure it was properly secured. He had a key card to the hangar. No one had revoked it yet. He let himself in and did a quiet walkthrough of the H-175. Nothing had been touched. It sat there in the hangar the way a finished thing sits, complete, contained, waiting for someone to put it to use. He ran his hand along the tail boom the way he sometimes did, not for any technical reason, just the habit of a man who'd spent years putting broken things back together. His phone rang at 9:23. Not Victoria. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had always been professionally pleasant to him in the way that executive assistants are pleasant to vendors they've been instructed to be pleasant to. Mr. Ryder, Ms. Sterling would like to meet with you at 11. Conference room B. Not the main conference room? A half-second pause. Conference room B. Just Ms. Sterling. So she'd read it, or at least opened it. I'll be there, Mason said. He spent the time until 11 in the hangar, not doing much of anything useful, which was unusual for him. He sat on a rolling stool near the workbench and looked at his notes. He thought about what he'd say and what he wouldn't say. He thought about Cahill, about the lunch, about the way Cahill's eyes had gone sideways when Mason had said the word alone in the conference room. He thought about the 14 aircraft carrying his name on approvals he'd never given, and the slow-burning anger of that. Not hot anger, not the kind that makes you raise your voice, but the deep, patient, structural anger of someone whose professional identity has been quietly stolen and used. At 5 to 11, he walked to conference room B. Victoria Sterling was already there. She was alone. She hadn't brought the lawyers. The envelope was open on the table in front of her, the 14 pages spread out. She looked like she hadn't slept. Not the theatrical version of that. Not dramatic dark circles or disheveled hair. She just looked like a person who'd been sitting with something difficult since the night before and hadn't found a way to set it down. She didn't say anything when he walked in. She looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the pages. Sit down, she said finally. Not a command, almost a request. He sat across from her. She picked up the page with the forged certification numbers and held it without reading it, the way people hold things they've already read too many times. You found all of this during the restoration, she said. Yes. And you didn't tell me. I documented it. I kept documenting it. I needed enough to show you the full picture, not just individual pieces that could be explained away. She looked up. Explained away by who? He didn't answer that directly. The envelope has what I thought you needed to see immediately. I have significantly more. She put the page down. How much more? 79 pages of documentation. Component serial numbers traced to a supplier that doesn't exist. Invoice trails showing $2.3 million paid to a company registered 14 months ago, with no physical address, no FAA approvals, and no actual inventory. And my certification number on maintenance approvals for 14 aircraft I've never inspected. She was quiet for a while, long enough that he could hear the ventilation system in the building. Someone used your license number, she said. Yes. On aircraft in my fleet. Yes. She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose, just for a second. Then she put her hand back on the table. If this is real, it's real. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying if the documentation holds up to scrutiny, then someone inside this company has been running a fraud operation for nearly 2 years, and I didn't know about it. She said it flat, not looking for sympathy, not performing outrage, just saying it like a fact she was still getting used to. Mason respected that about her. He hadn't expected to. Ms. Sterling, he said, the invoice I presented yesterday is accurate. I can walk you through every line item, but that's not the conversation that matters right now. She looked at him. Right now what matters is that you have aircraft in your active fleet that may be flying with fraudulent components certified by a ghost company and authorized with a license number belonging to someone who never inspected them. One of those aircraft, I can tell you the registration number, is scheduled for a charter flight next Thursday carrying 8 passengers. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. "Which aircraft?" she said. He told her. She picked up her phone. He watched her dial. Not an assistant, not a department line, a direct call. Someone answered, and she said, in a voice that had gone very calm in the way that dangerous rivers go calm before something happens, "I need a full ground stop on Echo 907 Foxtrot. Immediately. No one touches it, no one moves it, it does not fly. Yes, now." She ended the call and looked back at Mason. "Walk me through the rest of it," she said. So he did. It took 2 hours. He'd brought his laptop and the full documentation set, and he walked her through it methodically. Not rushing, not editorializing, just laying out what he'd found and when he'd found it and what it meant technically. He explained the difference between a correctly certified component and a counterfeit one that looked right on inspection but had no verified manufacturing chain. He explained what it meant for an aircraft to carry a maintenance record signed off by a certification number that didn't correspond to any actual inspection. She asked good questions. Better than he'd expected. She didn't understand all the technical details. That wasn't her background. But she understood systems, and she understood when something that was supposed to be a checkpoint had been made into a rubber stamp. About halfway through, she asked a question he'd been expecting. "Why didn't you come to me earlier, when you first found the discrepancies?" He considered how to answer that honestly. "Because I didn't know who else knew," he said. "I still don't, entirely. If I'd gone to you with 2 suspicious component numbers in week 3, and you'd mentioned it to the wrong person before I had the full picture, the documentation would have disappeared and I'd have been the mechanic making unfounded accusations." She absorbed that. "You didn't trust me," she said. "I didn't know you," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment like she was deciding whether that distinction mattered. "And now?" she said. "Now you're sitting in a room without your lawyers, with an aircraft already grounded, asking the right questions. So." She almost smiled. Not quite. The situation didn't have room for it yet. When they finished, she sat back in her chair and rubbed the side of her neck with one hand, a gesture he recognized as someone who'd been holding tension in the same place for too long. "I need to contact legal," she said, "and our insurance carrier, and probably—" She paused. "External counsel, not our regular firm." "I'd recommend that, yes." "And the FAA. Sooner rather than later. If you self-report before they come to you, it changes the posture significantly." She nodded slowly. "I need a copy of everything you have." "I'll send it to whatever attorney you designate, not directly to Sterling Aero Group. It should be in protected channels." She looked at him like that surprised her slightly. "You've thought this through," she said. "I had a couple months," he said. She stood up. He stood up. For a moment, they were just 2 people standing on opposite sides of a conference table in a building where something had gone badly wrong, trying to figure out what happened next. "About the invoice," she started. "We can deal with that after," he said. "The aircraft matter is more urgent." She nodded. Then she held out her hand. He shook it. "I'm sorry," she said, "for yesterday, the way that was handled." "I know," he said. He meant it simply. Not as forgiveness, not as absolution, just as acknowledgement that he could see she meant it. The rest of it was still complicated. It was going to stay complicated for a while. He left the conference room and walked back through the hangar. Outside, the sky had gone overcast while he was inside, the kind of flat gray sky that felt like the weather was deciding something. He sat in his car for a few minutes, then called Rex. "She read it," he said when Rex picked up. "How'd she take it?" "Better than I expected. Worse than she'd like, I think. She grounded Echo 907, Rex breathed out. "Good. That one worried me most from what you described." "Yeah." Mason looked at the hangar. "Rex, how many aircraft do you think are compromised?" Rex was quiet for a moment. "From what you sent me?" "Conservatively, 7, possibly more. You'd need full inspection access to confirm." 7 aircraft, in a fleet of 18, flying passengers. "She's going to need a full fleet assessment," Mason said. "She's going to need a lot of things," Rex said. "You doing okay?" It was the kind of question Rex asked the way most people didn't, not as conversation filler, but as an actual inquiry. They'd known each other since their second year in the Army, when Mason had pulled Rex out from under a Bell helicopter during a maintenance accident that nobody on base had wanted to put in the official report. Rex took his questions about Mason's well-being seriously. "I'm fine," Mason said. "You sound like a man who's fine." "I'm tired, but fine." "How's Lily?" "Good. Apparently Deb's dog ate her math homework." That's a classic. I know. There was a pause, comfortable the way long silences between people who've known each other a long time can be. "You did right, Mason," Rex said. "Documenting everything, not going in half-cocked. You did right." Mason didn't say anything for a second. "I didn't do anything yet," he said. "I just took pictures and kept records." "That's how this kind of thing gets fixed," Rex said. "Not with somebody going in swinging, with pictures and records." After they hung up, Mason drove back to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the 14 aircraft whose maintenance records bore his name. He thought about the mechanics who'd signed off on them. Whether they'd known, whether they'd been pressured, whether some of them were as much victims of this as the passengers who'd flown on those aircraft without knowing what was holding them in the air. He thought about Cahill. He hadn't said Cahill's name to Victoria. Not yet. He'd shown her the documentation trail without explicitly naming who he thought was responsible, because pointing a finger at a specific person too early was how you turned a systematic investigation into a personal dispute. But the lunch, the attempted bribe, the smooth practiced way Cahill had named exactly the right components to approve without fully inspecting, components that Mason now knew were almost certainly part of the fraudulent supply chain. Cahill hadn't stumbled into that conversation. He'd gone into it knowing what he was asking. Mason opened his notebook and wrote down the sequence of events one more time, in order, just to fix them clearly in his head. The wrong component number in week 1, the actuator serial number in week 3, the 5 additional components by week 5, the forged certification records, the Apex Aviation invoices, the lunch, the $2.3 million. He looked at what he'd written. He'd been hired to fix a helicopter. What he'd actually spent 4 months doing was documenting a criminal operation sophisticated enough to have stayed hidden for nearly 2 years inside a company with its own maintenance department, its own lawyers, its own procurement team. That meant either those people were incompetent or they weren't looking, or some of them were looking the other way. He thought about the 2 lawyers who'd been in the conference room the day before, sitting with their pens ready. He thought about how quickly the security guard had appeared at the door. He thought about who would have called him. He closed his notebook. His phone buzzed, a text from Victoria's assistant, Priya. "Ms. Sterling wanted me to confirm the invoice total from yesterday and ask if you can resend the document version." He read it twice. Then he pulled up the invoice on his laptop and sent it to the email address Priya had written from. The number hadn't changed. He hadn't touched it. It was what it was, and it always had been. He ordered food from a Thai place 3 blocks from the hotel, ate it sitting cross-legged on the bed watching a basketball game he had no strong feelings about, and called Lily at exactly 7. "Dad, I have a question." "Okay. If a dog eats your homework, do you still have to redo it?" "Yeah, Lily." "Even if you have proof the dog ate it?" "Even then." She made the sound she made when something was deeply unfair. It was a very specific sound, a kind of deflating sigh that he'd been hearing since she was 4 years old and had started having opinions about the world. "What if I video the dog eating it?" "Then you have a video and no homework. Do the homework." "Dad?" "Lily." Another deflating sigh. Then, "How much longer are you going to be in Houston?" He looked at the wall, at the generic print that all hotel rooms seemed to have, abstract blues and grays in a frame that matched the bedspread. "I'm not sure exactly," he said. "It got a little more complicated." "More complicated how?" "Work stuff. I'll explain when I'm home." "Is it bad complicated or just complicated? He considered that question more seriously than a 9-year-old probably intended. "Just complicated," he said. "I'm fine. Everything's okay." "Promise?" "Promise." She seemed to accept that. They talked for another 20 minutes about the dog, about Deb's cooking, about a book her teacher had recommended that Lily had started and was making faces at but secretly liked, which was the way she engaged with most things she ended up caring about. After they hung up, he lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The 24 hours he'd given Victoria had passed differently than he'd imagined. Not worse, maybe, but differently. He thought she might call a lawyer. He thought she might double down on the disputed invoice, come at him with a formal dispute process, try to outlast him on institutional resources. He hadn't quite imagined her spreading 14 pages across a conference table and asking him to walk her through it. He hadn't imagined her grounding the aircraft herself, directly, without going through Cahill or anyone else in the maintenance chain. That was interesting. He'd been turning it over since he left the building. She'd gone around Cahill. Whether she'd done it consciously or on instinct, she'd made that call herself, which meant something in her, maybe something she couldn't quite name yet, had registered that the normal chain of command was not the right channel for this particular instruction. She was smart. He'd known that from the first phone call. What he hadn't known was whether smart was enough. Given how deep the problem went and how long it had been running and how many people around her had been either involved or willfully blind, that question was still open. He fell asleep with the light on and the basketball game still going, something he hadn't done since Lily was a newborn, and he used to fall asleep in the chair in her room, waiting to see if she'd settle. He dreamed about nothing, he remembered. In the morning, everything was different. He was on his third cup of coffee at the diner. Paulette had not commented on his appearance, which meant he looked marginally better than the day before, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. Mr. Ryder. Male voice. Measured. The kind of controlled professional neutral that Mason associated with people in regulatory or law enforcement roles. My name is Gregory Okafor. I'm an aviation safety inspector with the FAA's Flight Standards District Office in Houston. I was hoping you might have time to speak with us today. Mason set down his coffee cup. How did you get this number? He asked. Not hostile, just direct. We received independent documentation this morning relating to maintenance record irregularities at Sterling Aero Group. Your name appears in the records in a way that suggests you may have relevant knowledge. We'd like to talk to you voluntarily before we proceed with the formal investigation. Mason thought about Rex, about the encrypted copies he'd emailed 3 weeks ago, about Rex's long history as an FAA compliance investigator who would have known exactly who to contact and exactly how. When? Mason said. This morning, if possible. We have a field office. I know where the field office is. He'd driven past it twice in the past month. Give me an hour. He paid Paulette, tipped her $20, and drove back to the hotel to get his documentation files. The FAA field office was a modest building that smelled like printer toner and weak coffee. The universal smell, Mason had always thought, of federal institutions trying to do serious work on inadequate budgets. Gregory Okafor turned out to be a trim, careful man in his early 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to listen before they spoke. He had a colleague with him, a younger woman named Sato, who took notes and asked sharper questions than her quiet presence initially suggested. Mason sat down across from them and put his laptop and the printed documentation set on the table. Before we start, he said, I want to be clear about something. Okafor nodded. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm here because I spent 4 months in that hangar and I documented what I found, and what I found matters for public safety. I want to cooperate fully. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just need you to understand that some of these maintenance records carry my certification number, and I have never inspected those aircraft. Whatever happened to those records happened without my knowledge or consent. We understand, Okafor said. That's actually one of the reasons we wanted to speak with you directly and quickly, to separate your involvement from the fraudulent record activity. Good. Can you walk us through your findings in chronological order? So he did it again. For the second time in 2 days, he sat across a table from people with authority over what happened next and laid out everything, component by component, date by date, supplier invoice by supplier invoice. He was better at it the second time, tighter. He'd learned from walking Victoria through it which details needed more explanation and which spoke for themselves. Okafor and Sato asked questions throughout. They were technical and specific, The kind of questions that told Mason they'd already seen documentation that confirmed some of what he was saying before he walked in the room. Someone had given them a head start. After 2.5 hours, Okafor set down his pen and looked at Mason directly. Mr. Ryder, based on what you've provided and what we've received through other channels, we're initiating a formal safety investigation of the Sterling Aero Group fleet. We'll be seeking emergency authority to inspect all aircraft in the active fleet. All 18? Potentially, yes. Mason was quiet for a moment. There's one aircraft I'm particularly concerned about, Echo 907 Foxtrot. It was grounded yesterday on Ms. Sterling's direct order, but it's already on our list, Sato said. It won't fly. He felt something ease in his chest. Not relief exactly. There was too much still unresolved for relief. More like a held breath partially released. One more thing, Okafor said. The certification records bearing your license number. We'll need to formally document that those are fraudulent authorizations. You'll be asked to provide a sworn statement to that effect. I'll provide whatever you need. It may involve you appearing before a formal review board at some stage. I know. Okafor studied him briefly. You seem very calm for someone whose professional license has been misused in a criminal fraud scheme. Mason thought about how to answer that. I documented everything, he said. Every step. I'm not calm because I'm not bothered. I'm calm because I have 347 pages of restoration records, 79 pages of fraud documentation, and I have never, in 20 years of working on aircraft, signed off on something I didn't inspect personally. He paused. The records will clear themselves. Okafor nodded slowly. Something in his expression suggested that in his career he had seen many people in situations like Mason's, and not many of them had walked in with 79 pages. Mason drove back to the hotel. He sat in the parking lot for a while, engine off, looking at the side of the building. A maid was pushing a cart along the second-floor walkway. A couple was loading bags into a car in the next row over, arguing in the comfortable way of people who have been arguing about the same things for 20 years. He'd started this job because the contract would change his financial situation enough to matter. He'd accepted it because he believed the helicopter was repairable when others said it wasn't. He'd stayed because he wasn't the kind of man who walked away from work he'd committed to. He hadn't expected to spend 4 months carefully, quietly, building a case that would eventually ground 12 aircraft and bring federal investigators to a Houston airfield on a February morning. He thought about the first wrong component number, how small it had been, how easy to dismiss. One number, on one sensor, on one aircraft. He thought about what would have happened if he'd dismissed it. He pulled out his phone and texted Rex. FAA sat down with me this morning. Full investigation initiated. Rex replied in under a minute. Good. You okay? Mason typed back, yeah. Ask me again in a month. Rex sent back a thumbs up, and then, a few seconds later, buy Lily something nice when you get home. He laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that's mostly just exhaled air, but it was real. He got out of the car and went inside. He had a lot of phone calls to make, and none of them were going to be easy, and he was going to make all of them anyway. That was more or less how Mason Ryder had always operated. Not because he was built differently than other people, but because he'd learned a long time ago in a different kind of high-stakes environment that the only way to get through something hard was to keep doing the next right thing, even when you were tired, even when the outcome was uncertain, even when the people who were supposed to have things under control clearly didn't. One thing at a time. Document everything. Don't let them see you sweat. He sat down at the small hotel desk, opened his laptop, and started writing up his account of the FAA meeting while the details were still sharp. Outside, Houston went on being Houston, loud, sprawling, indifferent to the particular drama unfolding in a regional airfield on its western edge. Somewhere across the city, 12 helicopters that should not have been flying were sitting on the ground. For now, that was enough. The grounding order came down on a Thursday. Mason was at the hotel when his phone started going off. First Rex, then Okafor from the FAA field office. Then a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be a journalist from the Houston Chronicle who had somehow already gotten wind that something was happening at Sterling Aero Group's facility. He didn't answer the journalist. He called Rex back first. 12 aircraft, Rex said without preamble. They just issued the emergency airworthiness directive. The whole active charter fleet is grounded pending inspection. Mason sat down on the edge of the bed. All 12. All 12. They're sending inspection teams to the facility this afternoon. Okafor's leading it. Rex paused. It's moving fast, Mason. Faster than these things usually move. Because of Echo 9 or 7. Because of what they found on Echo 9 or 7, Rex said. They did a preliminary structural inspection yesterday evening. There's a crack in the main frame junction that should have been caught 18 months ago. It's not a maybe. It's a definitive structural failure in progress. If that aircraft had flown Thursday's charter, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mason looked at the wall. At the abstract print with the blues and grays, he'd been in this room long enough that he'd stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing things that are always there. How many people were on Thursday's manifest? He said. 8 passengers, 2 crew. 10 people. He thought about that number in a specific, concrete way, not as an abstraction, but as 10 separate individuals who had plans for Friday, who had people who expected them home, who had no idea that the aircraft they'd been planning to board was being held together by fraudulent paperwork and wishful thinking. Mason, Rex said, I'm here. You did what you were supposed to do. I know. I mean it. You documented it. You preserved it. You got it to the right people. The system worked because you made it work. The system worked because you knew who to call, Mason said. We're a team, Rex said simply. Always have been. After he hung up, Mason sat there for a while longer than he needed to. There was no dramatic feeling to it, no surge of vindication, no clean sense of resolution. Mostly he felt tired and a little hollowed out, the way you feel after you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and someone finally takes it from you. The weight is gone, but your body still remembers the shape of it. He got up, put on his jacket, and drove to the facility. The FAA inspection teams were already there when he arrived. 2 white government vehicles in the parking lot, an additional van he didn't recognize that probably belonged to a contracted inspection firm. The security guard at the main gate, a different one from the usual, looked at his key card with uncertainty. I'm not sure you're on the current access list, sir. Call Gregory Okafor, Mason said. Tell him Mason Ryder is at the gate. He waited 4 minutes. Then the gate opened. The hangar was different than he'd ever seen it. Not physically different, but atmospherically. The kind of different that a space becomes when the people in it are doing something with real consequences. 3 inspectors in gray coveralls were working on a helicopter in the far bay. 2 men in suits who were definitely lawyers stood near the administrative entrance talking in low voices. A woman he didn't recognize was taking photographs of the maintenance records wall, the big pegboard near the operations office where Sterling kept its fleet status charts. Okafor found him near the entrance to Hangar 4. Mr. Ryder, he shook Mason's hand. You didn't have to come. I wanted to see it through. Okafor studied him for a moment. We're going to need you available for questions as the inspections proceed. There are technical aspects of your documentation that our team needs help interpreting, specifically the component serial number cross-referencing. Whatever you need. Is there somewhere you can be reached consistently over the next several days? I'll stay in Houston as long as you need me to. Okafor nodded. Then he said with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words, the preliminary findings on Echo 9 or 7 are significant. The structural issue alone would have justified the grounding. But the pattern your documentation describes, the supply chain, the certification forgeries, that's going to require a much broader investigation than just this facility. How broad? The supplier network you identified, Apex Aviation Components. We've already flagged it with our national office. If they were supplying parts to Sterling, they may have been supplying other operators. Mason absorbed that. Other fleets. Potentially. We're still pulling the thread. Okafor paused. The work you did over 4 months may end up mattering well beyond this company. Mason didn't say anything to that. He wasn't sure what to say. He'd started this job thinking about Lily's college fund and a contract that would give him financial breathing room for the first time in years. The distance between that and where he was standing now felt enormous. He spent the morning in a corner of the administrative wing with two of Okafor's technical team, walking them through the component documentation point by point. They were good at their jobs, methodical, skeptical in the right ways, the kind of people who asked follow-up questions when an answer was too clean. By noon, they'd confirmed 11 of the 14 forged certification records independently and were working on the remaining 3. At 12:30, the lawyers in suits moved, both of them together, toward the executive suite. Mason watched them go and said nothing. At 1:15, Dennis Cahill walked out of the facility's main building. He was with a woman Mason didn't recognize, 40-ish, dark coat, the particular expression of someone professionally trained to reveal nothing. His attorney, probably. Cahill was wearing his usual button-down with the Sterling logo, but he'd put a jacket over it, and something about his posture had changed. The wide stance, broad-shouldered ease he usually carried had contracted into something tighter and more careful. He saw Mason across the parking lot. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Cahill looked away. He said something to the woman in the dark coat, and she touched his arm briefly, and they kept walking toward the parking lot without looking back. Mason watched them go. He felt nothing particularly satisfying about it. He'd expected to, maybe. Some small gratification at seeing the man who'd sat across from him in a barbecue booth and offered him a consultant contract in exchange for his professional integrity, now walking out under very different circumstances. But what he actually felt was something flatter and more complicated, a kind of tiredness at the fact that this was how these things always went. Someone in a position of trust chose the wrong thing and then spent a long time managing the consequences of that choice, and the people around them paid various prices. And eventually there was an accounting. Nothing about it felt like a win. It just felt like what happened. He went back inside. The afternoon brought a development he hadn't anticipated. At around 3 o'clock, Okafor's colleague Sato found him in the documentation room and said, with a careful expression, "Ms. Sterling would like to speak with you. She's in the executive conference room. She asked if you'd be willing." Mason looked at Sato. "Is this part of the investigation?" "No, it's a separate request. You're not obligated." He thought for a moment. "Okay." Victoria Sterling was sitting alone in the executive conference room, not the main one with the long table and the glass walls, but a smaller room off the side of the floor that had mismatched chairs and a whiteboard covered in organizational charts that someone had started to erase and then abandoned. She looked like she'd been in meetings for 12 straight hours, which she probably had. Her blazer was off. Her hair, which was always pulled back, had a strand escaping on one side that she hadn't fixed. She looked, for the first time since he'd met her, like a person rather than a position. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Sure." He sat down. She had her hands flat on the table in front of her. She was looking at them like they were an interesting problem. "I've spent the last 6 hours with FAA investigators, 2 sets of attorneys, our insurance carrier, and our board of directors," she said. "In approximately that order." "How'd that go?" She laughed, which surprised him. It was a short, dry, humorless laugh, but it was real. "Badly, in various ways. The board is—" She stopped. "They're doing what boards do when something goes wrong, which is look for the fastest way to make the liability sit somewhere other than on them." "That's pretty standard." "I know." She rubbed the side of her neck. He'd seen her do that before. The same spot, same gesture. "The FAA has indicated they'll need approximately 2 weeks to complete the preliminary fleet inspection. During that time, we're fully grounded. No charters, no operations." She paused. "The merger is on hold." "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it in a limited but genuine way. She looked at him like she was deciding whether that was true. "Are you?" "The merger isn't your fault," he said. "Whatever went wrong here, you weren't running the fraud." "No, but I was running the company that the fraud ran through." She said it simply, without self-pity. "I put a lot of pressure on this operation to grow, to take on more contracts, more clients, expand the fleet faster than maybe we should have. I created conditions where people who wanted to cut corners felt like they had room to do it." Mason was quiet. "I'm not saying that to get something from you," she said, as if she'd read the cautious way he'd received it. "I know it doesn't fix anything. I'm just—" She stopped, started again. I've been sitting in rooms all day with people telling me what to say and what not to say, and how to position this, and what my legal exposure is. And I just needed to say something real to someone who was actually in the building when this was happening. He understood that. It was actually a very human thing to need. What do you want to know? He said. When you found the first discrepancy, the first wrong component number, what did you think? He considered that. I thought it was a cataloging error. They happen. But you wrote it down. I write everything down. Why? Because in my work, the documentation is the job. The physical repair is only half of it. If you can't prove what you did and what you found, the work might as well not have happened. He paused. And because a long time ago, in the Army, I learned that the people who document things are the people who are still standing at the end of the day when something goes wrong. She nodded slowly. When did you realize it wasn't a cataloging error? Week 5. When I found the 5th component with a suspect serial number, I stopped giving the benefit of the doubt. He looked at her directly. At that point, I had a decision to make. Document everything and wait until I had the full picture, or go to someone inside the company and risk the evidence disappearing. You chose to wait. I chose to be sure first. That must have been... She looked for the word. Lonely. He thought about the hotel room, about the basketball game he hadn't watched, about Lily's voice at 7 o'clock every night, the one thing in this whole complicated stretch of time that had felt simple. Yeah, he said. It was. She nodded. Then she said, the invoice, the real amount. I want to pay it. We can handle that through... I know we can handle it through the formal dispute process. I'm telling you, I'm not disputing it. Whatever the correct number is, I'll make sure it's paid, with interest for the delay. She looked at him steadily. That's not a legal statement. That's a personal one. You did the work. You should be paid for it. He studied her for a moment. She meant it. He could tell the difference by now. He'd had enough dealings with people in this industry who said things they didn't mean in rooms like this one. Okay, he said. And your license, the forged records, is there... Do you need anything from us to help clear that? The FAA is handling it. Once the investigation establishes the forgeries, the records get corrected. It's a process. He paused. It'll take time, but it'll get done. She nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else and wasn't sure how to. For what it's worth, she said finally, what you did, spending 4 months documenting all of this instead of just finishing the job and walking away, a lot of people wouldn't have done that. It was the job, he said. The documentation wasn't in your contract. It was still the job. She looked at him like she was trying to understand something about the way he was made. He didn't know how to explain it to her. That for him, the line between the work and the documentation of the work had never been separable. That you couldn't really do one without the other. That his Army training had wired that into him so deeply it had become reflex rather than decision. You fixed the machine, you wrote down what you'd fixed, you signed your name to it. Those were not 3 steps, they were 1 step. He stood up. She stood up. Ms. Sterling, he said, one thing. She waited. The mechanics in your maintenance department, the ones who were signing off on things they maybe shouldn't have been signing off on. Some of them may have been pressured into it. Some of them might have been threatened. It's worth finding out which ones knew what they were doing and which ones were just trying to keep their jobs before you make any decisions about them. She absorbed that. Are you asking me to go easy on them? I'm asking you to find out who they are before you assume you know. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed in a way he couldn't fully name. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He nodded and left. In the parking lot, sitting in his car, he thought about the conversation, about the way she'd said the word lonely, like she'd recognized something in what he'd described that she understood from her own experience, about the way she'd sat with her hands flat on the table and said something real when she could have said something strategic. He wasn't ready to trust her. Trust was a different thing from what had happened in that room, but he thought there might be a person in there worth the possibility of trust, once all the institutional armor got stripped away by what was coming, which it would be. When a company's entire fleet gets grounded and federal investigators start pulling threads that lead to ghost suppliers and forged records, all the professional armor in the world eventually comes off. What you're left with is just the person underneath. He hoped the person underneath her was better than the circumstances she'd created. He genuinely did. He drove back to the hotel, changed his clothes, and called Rex. Cahill left the building this afternoon, he said, with an attorney. Yeah. Rex was quiet for a moment. He knew you were coming. He spent 2 months trying to manage you. The lunch, Mason said. The lunch was the obvious move. Offer money, see if you fold. When you didn't fold, they probably hoped you'd just finish the job and leave town and the invoice dispute would drag on long enough that you'd settle for something lower. Rex paused. They didn't account for your documentation being as good as it is. No. Mason, they used your license number. That wasn't incidental. That was deliberate. Someone decided that attaching your name to those records gave them legitimacy because you have a clean certification history and a reputation for thorough work. Mason had thought about this. Had thought about it a lot, actually, in the sleepless stretches of the past weeks. So they picked me specifically, he said. I think so, yeah. Gerald Pham recommending you to Sterling. They probably saw that as a feature, not a problem. Get the most thorough, most reputable independent mechanic in the region in the hangar working on the H-175, and in the meantime use his certification number to legitimize everything else they'd been doing. Except they didn't count on me going through the rest of the maintenance records. They counted on you to fix the helicopter and leave, Rex said. Most people would have. Mason thought about the first component number, the sensor on the hydraulic pressure system, how small it had been. Rex, he said, the Apex Aviation supplier, the one that may have been supplying other operators. The national office is on it. They're pulling every FAA registered operator that shows Apex in their parts procurement records over the past 24 months. How many? They don't know yet. Could be a few. Could be a lot more. Rex paused. If this is what it looks like, it's not a small-time operation. Someone put a lot of effort into building Apex as a credible-looking ghost entity. The documentation is sophisticated. The invoicing matches industry standards closely enough that it would pass a casual audit. Who has the capability to run something like that? Someone with industry knowledge, deep industry knowledge, not a random fraudster who stumbled into aviation. Rex let that sit for a moment. The investigators will find the chain. It takes time, but these things unravel once you start pulling. After they hung up, Mason ordered food again. The same Thai place, because he'd found something he liked, and he wasn't interested in being adventurous when everything else in his life was uncertain. He ate, checked his emails, responded to a message from Okafor confirming his availability for the following morning's inspection review, and called Lily. She answered on the first ring, which was unusual. Dad. Something in the single word made him sit up straighter. Not distress exactly, but something. Hey, what's up? Deb told me the news, she said, about the helicopters being grounded. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't thought about the fact that the grounding of an entire commercial fleet was potentially newsworthy enough to reach San Antonio. Where'd she see it? On the news app on her phone. There was a thing about a helicopter company in Houston having a safety issue and all their planes getting grounded by the FAA. They're helicopters, not planes. Dad, sorry, yeah, I saw that. Were you involved? He thought about how to answer that, about what version of the truth was appropriate for a 9-year-old who was already worried about him being far away for longer than expected. I was the mechanic who worked on one of their helicopters, he said, and I found some problems during the restoration, so I reported them. A pause. Is that why you said it got complicated? Yeah. Are you in trouble? No, sweetheart, I'm not in trouble. Because on the news it said there was fraud. He closed his eyes briefly. Deb was going to get a phone call about news app supervision. There was fraud by other people, he said. I was the one who found it and reported it. I'm fine. Another pause, longer this time. Dad, she said. Did you know it was dangerous? Like, did you know something might happen to people? He thought about Echo 9 or 7, about the 10 people on Thursday's manifest, about the crack in the mainframe junction that should have been caught 18 months ago. I found out it could be dangerous, he said, and I made sure it didn't happen. The pause this time was the longest. Okay, she said finally in a small voice. Lily? Yeah? I'm fine. I'm coming home soon. I'm going to call you at 7 every night until I do. You missed last Tuesday. I know. I'm sorry about that. You said sorry already. I'm saying it again. She seemed to consider whether this was adequate. Then, okay, will you be home before my science project is due? I need help with the poster board. When is it due? March 3rd. He pulled up the calendar on his phone. 10 days. I'll be home before March 3rd. Promise? Promise. She accepted that and told him about the science project, something involving plant growth in different kinds of soil, which sounded like it had been interesting for approximately the first day and tedious ever since, based on her tone. He listened and asked questions and let himself exist in that narrow frequency for a while. The one that was just his kid's voice and the ordinary texture of her life, uncomplicated by fraud investigations and federal inspectors and the weight of knowing that 10 people had almost gotten on a compromised aircraft. After she hung up, the ordinary weight of everything came back. The next 3 days moved in a strange, suspended rhythm. Mason in and out of the Sterling facility, working alongside the FAA inspection teams, answering questions, clarifying documentation, identifying which components in which aircraft corresponded to the Apex Aviation invoices. The physical work of inspecting 12 helicopters was enormous, and the inspection teams were methodical and slow in the way that safety-critical work has to be slow. There were no shortcuts. Every finding was documented twice. On the second day, one of the inspection team's technical members, a woman named Dabrowski, who was somewhere in her 40s, and had the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years not having time for nonsense, found something on a third aircraft that Mason hadn't caught. It was a rotor blade that had been resurfaced and recertified through a process that, on paper, looked legitimate. The certification traced to a maintenance facility in Louisiana. When Dabrowski ran the facility's credentials, they came back as lapsed. The facility had lost its certification 14 months ago, a fact that had apparently not been communicated to anyone at Sterling who cared about it. She showed Mason the paperwork. "This one wasn't in your documentation," she said. Not accusatory, just noting it. "I wasn't inspecting the full fleet," he said. "I was working on one aircraft. The rest of what I found was in the maintenance records." Right. She was looking at the rotor blade with the expression of someone doing math in her head. "The Louisiana facility. This is a different thread than your Apex supplier." "Yeah. Which means the supply chain problem may be more distributed than we thought." Mason looked at the rotor blade. "Or it means someone was running multiple channels for the same reason." Dabrowski looked at him. "You have a theory?" "I have an observation. Redundant fraud channels are more work to set up but harder to trace because the problems don't all connect to the same source. If you follow Apex, you get one trail. If you follow the Louisiana facility, you get another. Each one explains some of the discrepancies, but not all of them. So an investigator who only pulls one thread thinks they've found the problem when they've actually only found part of it." Dabrowski was quiet for a moment. "That's a sophisticated observation. I've been thinking about this for 2 months." She looked at him with what seemed like a new degree of respect, or at least attention. "You should put that in writing, for Okafor." "I was going to." She went back to the rotor blade. He went back to his documentation. On the third day, the news got bigger. A Houston Chronicle reporter published a story that used sources Mason couldn't identify. Not him, he'd said nothing to any journalist, to describe a wide-ranging maintenance fraud investigation at Sterling Aero Group involving falsified safety certifications and suspect parts suppliers. The story named no individuals by name, but described the investigation in enough technical detail that someone with industry knowledge had clearly been talking. By that afternoon, the story had been picked up by 3 national aviation trade publications and 1 major wire service. Mason read the article on his laptop in the hotel that evening and thought about what it would mean for Victoria Sterling. Not with sympathy exactly, but with the pragmatic awareness that the difference between a company surviving a scandal and collapsing under one was often not about the severity of the wrongdoing, but about how the news hit and in what sequence. If the story positioned Sterling as a victim of internal fraud who had cooperated with investigators, that was survivable. If it positioned her as someone who'd presided over a culture of deliberate safety violations, that was something else. The article was ambiguous in a way that could go either direction. He thought about the conversation in the small conference room, about her hands flat on the table, about the way she'd grounded Echo 907 herself, directly, without going through Cahill. He thought she was going to have to tell her own story, and it was going to have to be the true one. He was still sitting with that thought when his phone rang. Victoria Sterling, direct. He'd had her personal number since the second week of the job. She'd insisted all contractors have a direct line for urgent aircraft issues. He answered. "You've seen the article," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I didn't talk to them." "I know." He actually did believe her. It didn't match what he knew about how she operated. "My board wants me to make a statement. The communications team has drafted something." A pause. "It's very careful, very managed." "Okay." "I don't think it's right." He waited. "I think I should be more direct," she said, "about what I knew and when, about what went wrong operationally, about my own role in letting the conditions exist that allowed this to happen." Mason thought about that. "That's a significant thing to put on record publicly." "I know. Your lawyers are going to hate it. They already hate it. I told them what I was thinking about 20 minutes ago." He could imagine that conversation. He almost smiled. "Why are you calling me?" he said. Not unkindly, just the direct question. She was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the only person connected to this who doesn't have a personal stake in the story I tell. Cahill has a stake. My board has a stake. My lawyers definitely have a stake. You're just—" She stopped. "You're just the mechanic who found the problem." "That's not entirely true," he said. "My reputation is tied up in those forged records. I have a stake in this being reported accurately." "Fair," she said. "But you don't have a stake in protecting me." "No, I don't." Another pause. "Does the truth help me?" she said. It was a simple question, asked without calculation, and he recognized it as such. "I think the truth is the only thing that can help you," he said. "The documentation is comprehensive. The investigation is going to surface everything anyway. The choice isn't between the truth and something else. The choice is between you telling it first or someone else telling it for you." She was quiet for a long moment. "The managed statement would be more comfortable short-term," she said. "Yes. And worse long-term. In my experience." Another long pause. He heard her breathing. He heard, somewhere in the background of wherever she was, the faint sound of traffic. She was in the parking lot maybe, or near a window, getting away from the lawyers and the board and the communications team for 5 minutes to make a phone call to the mechanic. "Okay," she said. "Okay. You're going with the direct version?" "Okay, I'm going with the direct version." He nodded to himself. "Good luck with your lawyers." "They're going to be very unhappy." Lawyers usually are when they're not in control of the narrative. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Thank you, Mr. Ryder." "Mason." A brief pause. "Thank you, Mason." After she hung up, he sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Outside, Houston was doing what Houston did at night, loud, lit up, indifferent to the small dramas of people in hotel rooms. He could hear a siren somewhere in the distance, moving and then fading. He thought about the sequence of events that had started with a wrong component number on a hydraulic pressure sensor, about how something that small could unspool, given enough time and attention, into federal investigators and grounded fleets, and a CEO sitting in a parking lot deciding whether to tell the truth. He thought about how most people who'd spotted that first wrong number would have written it off, would have told themselves it was a clerical error, not worth the trouble, not their problem. Would have fixed the helicopter they'd been hired to fix and cashed the check and gone home. He'd never quite been able to do that. He didn't know if it was a virtue or just a kind of stubbornness that had never found a more productive outlet. Either way, here he was. He picked up his phone and called Lily at exactly 7 o'clock. She answered mid-sentence, something about soil samples and whether sand counted as dirt, and he let himself be pulled completely into the question of whether sand counted as dirt, because right now, that was exactly the problem he wanted to be solving. The rest of it would keep. Victoria Sterling's statement went out on a Monday morning, and it was not the careful, managed document her communications team had prepared. It was 3 pages. She'd written it herself, apparently, at some point over the weekend, and sent it to her outside counsel for review rather than her in-house team. Her in-house communications director had found out about it the same time the press did, which was how Mason heard the story secondhand from Priya, who called him for reasons he didn't entirely understand, except that Priya seemed to be one of those people who processed stress by sharing information. She just sent it, Priya said, without the board approving it first. Is that unusual? Mr. Ryder, the board approves what font we use on press releases. He read the statement on his laptop. It was direct in a way that corporate statements almost never are. Victoria acknowledged that the fleet had been grounded following a federal investigation into maintenance record irregularities. She acknowledged that the investigation had been initiated based on documentation developed during an independent restoration project. She didn't name Mason, which he appreciated. She said that preliminary findings indicated fraudulent component certifications and falsified maintenance records had existed within the company's operations for a significant period. She said she was cooperating fully with federal investigators. And then she said something that her lawyers had almost certainly argued against until they were exhausted. She said, "The conditions that allowed this fraud to operate were not created overnight. They were the result of growth pressure that I applied and a culture I allowed to develop in which operational concerns were consistently subordinated to financial targets. I am responsible for that culture. I cannot attribute what happened to bad actors alone when I created the environment in which those actors could function without adequate oversight." Mason read that paragraph twice. He didn't know many CEOs. He didn't move in those circles. But he knew enough about how institutional accountability worked, which was to say, how it usually didn't work, to understand that what she'd written was genuinely unusual. People in positions of authority almost never said I created the conditions. They said things like, "We are committed to accountability, and this does not reflect our values, and we have taken swift action." The passive voice was the natural language of institutional self-protection. She'd used active voice throughout. He closed the laptop and went to the facility for what he expected to be another documentation review session with Okafor's team. Instead, he found the parking lot fuller than he'd ever seen it. 3 additional government vehicles, a news van that had parked on the street outside the perimeter fence, and a cluster of people near the main building entrance who had the specific body language of people waiting for something to happen. Okafor met him at the hangar entrance. "The statement created some acceleration," Okafor said, with the careful understatement of a man who'd learned to describe chaos calmly. "What kind of acceleration?" "The National Office has formally opened a parallel investigation into the Apex Aviation supplier network. We've identified 7 additional operators in 3 states who show Apex in their parts procurement records over the past 20 months. 7 operators. Mason thought about what that meant in terms of aircraft, in terms of flights, in terms of passengers who'd been in the air in machines that had been maintained with parts from a company that didn't exist. "Any of them currently flying?" he said. 3 have been grounded pending inspection. The other 4 are being assessed. We expect additional grounding orders by end of week." Mason looked at the hangar. At the H-175 sitting inside, restored and complete and legitimate in a way that almost nothing else in this facility had been. "The Louisiana facility," he said. "The lapsed certification, Dabrowski's finding from Tuesday. Also accelerating. The Louisiana facility's ownership traces back to a holding company that is linked, indirectly, through 2 intermediary entities, to the same registered agent as Apex Aviation Components." Mason was quiet for a moment. "So it's one operation, not 2 separate threads." "That appears to be the case. Someone built multiple supply chain fronts that looked independent but were centrally controlled." Okafor paused. "This is a significantly more sophisticated criminal operation than what your initial documentation suggested. Your documentation pointed us in the right direction. The full scope is larger." "How much larger?" "We're still mapping it. But we're talking about an estimated 40 to 60 aircraft across multiple operators, 2 to 4 years of activity, and a total fraudulent parts procurement figure that may exceed $15 million. The number sat in the air between them. Mason had been in situations before where numbers had meant lives, where the specifications of a part or the tolerance of a system translated directly into whether people came home. In the Army, you developed a specific relationship with those numbers. You didn't dramatize them. You just held them. He held $15 million of fraudulent parts across 60 aircraft and thought about how many flights that represented, how many passengers, how many routine trips that everyone involved had assumed were safe. "Who built it?" he said. "We have a primary person of interest. We're not disclosing that yet." "Is it Cahill?" Okafor looked at him with the measured expression of a man who had practiced not answering certain questions. "I can't comment on individuals in an ongoing investigation," which was an answer, in its way. Mason nodded. "What do you need from me today?" "Your presence at a technical review this afternoon. We have inspectors who need clarification on some of your original component documentation. Specifically, the cross-referencing methodology you used to link the serial numbers to the Apex invoices. There's a question about whether that methodology will hold up under legal scrutiny." "It'll hold up," Mason said. "I'll explain it." He spent the morning doing what he'd been doing for days. Sitting in rooms with people who were doing serious work and helping them understand the technical pieces they didn't have the background to interpret on their own. He was good at it. He had always been good at explaining things to people who needed to understand them quickly and accurately, a skill he'd developed training junior mechanics in the Army and refined over years of working with clients who knew what they wanted from a helicopter, but not how the helicopter worked. At noon, he stepped outside to eat the sandwich he'd bought from a gas station because he kept forgetting to plan lunch until it was too late to do anything about it. He sat on a concrete planter near the main building entrance, eating a turkey sandwich that was adequate at best, watching the news van on the street outside the perimeter. The camera operator was sitting in the driver's seat, phone out, waiting. Nothing was happening worth filming yet. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Deb. "Lily's science project is almost done. She's been working on it every day. Thought you should know." He smiled at his phone in the way you smile at something that lands exactly right when you needed it to. He typed back. "Tell her I'm proud of her. Home before March 3rd. Deb replied with a photo. Lily at the kitchen table, bent over a poster board with a marker. Biscuit the dog, sleeping under her chair. Lily's hair was in a lopsided ponytail that suggested Deb had made an effort that Lily had partially undone. The poster board had plant drawings on it that were better than Mason would have expected. And the look on Lily's face as she worked was the look she got when she was genuinely engaged with something. The look that made everything about being her father feel worth whatever it cost. He looked at the photo for a moment, then put his phone away and finished the sandwich. The afternoon technical review went 3 hours. By the time he walked out, it was past 5, and the news van had been replaced by a different news van, suggesting the story had grown enough that the first outlet had sent reinforcements. He drove back to the hotel, showered, changed, and was sitting with his phone at 6:50 when it rang. Not Lily, Victoria Sterling. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not by phone. Can you come to the facility? Tonight, if possible." Something in her voice was different from the previous calls. Tighter, not quite controlled in the way she was usually controlled. "What happened?" he said. "The board met this afternoon." A pause. "After my statement." "That bad?" "3 members have called for my resignation, publicly, as of an hour ago." Another pause, and in it he could hear her working to keep her voice steady. "I'd like to talk to someone who isn't on my payroll before I make any decisions." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what it meant to be asked to play that role. Not a lawyer, not a communications advisor, not a board member. Just someone outside the institutional machinery. "Give me 30 minutes, he said. She was in her office when he arrived, which was a different space than the conference rooms he'd been in. A real working office, not a performance space, with stacks of folders on the desk and a whiteboard covered in notes and a view of the dark airfield through the window. She was on the phone when he came in, finished the call quickly, and sat down behind the desk. She looked like someone who had been in a fight and was deciding whether to get back up. 3 board members, he said, sitting down across from her. Richard Hamlin, Carolyn Mace, and Peter Voss. They released a joint statement 45 minutes ago saying they believe the CEO's handling of the public communications around the investigation has been, their word, imprudent, and that in light of the reputational risk to the company, they are calling for a leadership review. She said it flat, which is a polite way of saying they want me gone before this gets worse. Do they have the votes? Not yet. The board has 9 members. Those 3 plus 1 more is a majority. She paused. Gerald Foster hasn't said anything publicly, but his assistant has been calling Hamlin's office all day. Mason thought about this. Why? Why now after your statement? She leaned back in her chair. Because my statement removed their ability to distance themselves from the fraud by blaming it entirely on rogue employees. If I say I created the culture that enabled this, then the question becomes, what did the board know and when? And the answer to that is complicated. She looked at him steadily. Because I told them at 2 board meetings in the past 18 months that I was pushing for faster growth than our infrastructure comfortably supported. I said it in those exact terms in the minutes. They approved the growth targets anyway. So your statement put pressure on them. My statement made it a shared accountability question instead of a CEO failure question, and they don't want shared accountability. They want a head. She said it without self-pity, just clearly. What are you going to do? He said. She looked out the window at the dark airfield. I don't know, which is why I wanted to talk to someone who would just tell me what they actually thought instead of what was strategically advisable. He considered that. What do you want to do? I want to fight it, she said. I want to stay. I built this company. Not the fraud. The company. The client relationships, the operational reputation before all of this. The team. She paused. But I also know that part of what I said in that statement was true. I did push too hard, too fast. I did create conditions. And I'm not sure a person who did that deserves to be the one who fixes it. The room was quiet for a moment. Mason thought carefully before he spoke, because what she was asking wasn't a technical question with a documentable answer. It was something harder. In the Army, he said, I worked for a captain once. Good officer. Competent. Cared about his people. He made a call on a maintenance issue that turned out to be the wrong call. Not malicious, just wrong. Under pressure. With incomplete information. The aircraft had a problem we didn't catch, and we got lucky that it came down on the flight line and not over hostile territory. He paused. The question of what happens to that officer isn't about whether he was a good officer. It's about whether he understood what he'd done and could be trusted to make better calls afterward. She was watching him. Did he stay? She said. He stayed. He changed how he made decisions. He was more careful. He was more willing to stop and question his own assumptions. Mason paused. He wasn't the same kind of leader he was before. I'm not sure he was as confident, but he was more honest. And honestly, I trusted him more after. She was quiet for a long time. I'm not asking you to tell me to fight for my job, she said finally. I'm asking you whether someone who did what I did, even if it wasn't criminal, even if it was just negligent in a broad sense, whether that person fixing it means more than someone new coming in clean. I think the person who knows exactly what went wrong and why has a different ability to fix it than someone coming in from outside, he said, but only if they're honest about it. All the way honest. Not managed honest. Actually honest. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. My lawyers have aged 10 years since Saturday, she said. I imagine they have. She leaned forward and put her elbows on the desk and her chin in her hands and looked at him in a way that wasn't professional anymore, just tired and human and trying to think straight. Tell me honestly, she said. Do you think I knew? He held her gaze. No, I don't think you knew. I think people around you knew things and kept them from you because you'd created an environment where bad news was unwelcome. And I think you knew, on some level, that you'd created that environment, which is why you put it in the statement. She absorbed that. That's not entirely comfortable to hear, she said. You asked for honest. I know. She sat up, straightened. Okay. Okay? You're going to fight it? Okay, I'm going to fight it honestly, which means going to the board tomorrow and saying exactly what I said in the statement and making the case that the right person to oversee the reconstruction of this company is the one who understands specifically what broke and why. She paused. And if they vote me out anyway, then I'll accept that. That's reasonable, he said. She looked at him with something that might have been wry amusement in different circumstances. You're a very unusual person to talk to, do you know that? People keep suggesting that. Most people in your position, someone who'd been wronged by this company, who'd had their professional credentials misused, who was still waiting to get paid, most people in that position would want to see me fail. I don't want to see you fail, he said. I want to see the aircraft fixed, and I want the people who built the fraud to face the consequences of it. Those things don't require you to fail. She nodded slowly. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out an envelope and slid it across the desk. He picked it up. It had weight to it. What is this? The invoice, she said. Full amount, plus 30% interest for the delay, plus an additional amount that my personal accountant will explain, constitutes damages for the unauthorized use of your professional certification in the fraudulent records. That last part isn't required legally at this stage. It's just right. He looked at the envelope for a moment. You didn't have to do this now, he said, in the middle of all this. I know. She met his eyes. I wanted to. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. It wasn't the time or place to count it. He just knew it was there. There's something else, she said. The mechanics in the maintenance department, like you said. I looked into who knew what. And? 3 of them cooperated actively with Cahill, knowingly signed off on fraudulent records. They're gone. She said it without drama. 4 others. I think they were pressured, or they were given information that made the components look legitimate when they weren't. The documentation they were given had been manipulated upstream of them. She paused. I'm not firing them. I'm sending them to retraining. They'll work under enhanced supervision for a year. If they're clean, they stay. Mason thought about that. That's the right call. I know it's the right call. I'm not asking for your approval. She said it simply, not harshly. I'm just telling you because you asked me to look. Fair enough. He stood up to leave. She stood up too. Mason, she said. He stopped. The FAA investigation. When it's done, and I know it's going to take a long time, and I know there are going to be findings I'm not going to enjoy, but when it's done and we're permitted to operate again, I want to rebuild the fleet to a standard that makes what happened here genuinely impossible to repeat. She paused. I'd like your help with that. Not because I don't have qualified maintenance people. Because I want someone whose starting position is that the documentation matters as much as the physical work. And I've seen that you actually believe that. He looked at her. What would that involve? He said. Oversight role, full fleet inspection authority, safety decisions made independently from commercial pressure, fully, not as a policy that gets quietly overridden when there's a deadline. She met his eyes. Non-negotiable terms built into the contract structurally. Let me think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. He drove back to the hotel. It was past 9. He sat in the parking lot for a while, looking at the orange glow of the parking lot lights on the hood of the rental car. He thought about what she'd said, about the scope of it, about what it would mean to take on that kind of role. Not one job, not one aircraft, but a sustained engagement with a company that was going to spend the next year being rebuilt from the ground up. He thought about Lily's science project, about being home before March 3rd. He thought about what Rex had said. We're a team, always have been. And about how that had been true in the Army and had stayed true through everything since. 2 men who had known each other when they were young and reckless and were now older and careful and still, fundamentally, oriented toward the same thing, making sure the machine worked right, because the machine kept people alive. He called Rex. She offered me a long-term oversight role, he said when Rex picked up. Rex was quiet for a moment. What kind of oversight? Fleet inspection authority, safety independence written into the contract structurally. I'd have unilateral grounding authority, no commercial override. Another pause. That's a significant offer. I know. You thinking about taking it? I'm thinking about it. Rex made a sound that meant he understood the distinction. How'd she seem tonight? Different. Better? Mason paused. She's fighting to stay in the company. 3 board members called for her resignation after her statement. Yeah, I saw the news. What do you think? Is she going to make it? Mason considered that question with the same care he'd been giving everything in the past weeks. I think she might. She's not the same person she was when she tore that invoice in half. People don't change that fast, Rex said. It wasn't cynical, just an observation. No, but sometimes they figure out who they were supposed to be faster than usual when everything comes apart at once. Mason looked at the parking lot lights. She knew what she'd done. She put it in the statement. That's not nothing. No, Rex agreed. That's not nothing. They talked for a while about the investigation. Rex had contacts at the National FAA office and had been tracking the expansion of the Apex Aviation threat across multiple operators. The numbers were still growing, the total compromised aircraft count now potentially over 70. There were going to be congressional briefings. There were going to be industry hearings. The thread that Mason had started pulling with one component number on one hydraulic pressure sensor had become something that was going to reshape commercial helicopter maintenance regulation for years. You know they're going to want you to testify, Rex said, when this goes to hearings. I know. You okay with that? Mason thought about sitting in front of a room full of people in suits, explaining the difference between a certified component and a counterfeit one that looked right on inspection. He thought about 347 pages of restoration records and 79 pages of fraud documentation, organized with the same methodical care he applied to everything he'd ever done that mattered. Yeah, he said, I'm okay with that. After he hung up, he sat quietly in the parking lot for another few minutes. The night was clear and dry, and if he looked up past the parking lot lights, he could see a reasonable number of stars for a city this size. At 7:02, he realized he'd forgotten to call Lily. He dialed immediately. She answered on the 3rd ring, and in the background he could hear television noise and the sound of Biscuit doing something that apparently required a lot of movement. You're 2 minutes late, she said. I know. I'm sorry. That's 3 times. I know. I'm sorry, Lily. A pause in which she appeared to be deciding the severity of his crime. Okay, she said finally. Do you want to hear about the science project? More than anything, he said. And he meant it completely, in the specific way you mean something when it's the truest thing you can say in a given moment. More than anything. More than the investigation, more than the board vote, more than the long-term oversight offer, more than the 70 aircraft and the $15 million and the congressional hearings that were coming, more than any of it. She told him about the science project for 22 minutes. He listened to every word. The following morning, he arrived at the Sterling facility to find the energy of the place shifted again. Not the controlled urgency of the first days of the investigation, but something more deliberate. Okafor's teams were moving with the efficiency of people who'd found their rhythm. The inspection protocol was established. The documentation chain was clear. The work was no longer about discovering the problem. The problem had been discovered. Now it was about the careful, methodical business of proving what you knew in ways that would hold up to scrutiny. This was work Mason understood in his bones. He found Dabrowski in Hangar 3, working on the rotor blade from the lapsed Louisiana certification. She'd pulled the blade and was doing a materials analysis with a specialist who'd flown in from the FAA's technical center. How's it looking? Mason said. Dabrowski looked up. The surface composite has microscopic delamination in 2 sections. It's within current operational tolerances, barely. But the recertification process that approved it was fraudulent, so the question of what the actual fatigue history of this blade is, she shook her head. We don't know. Without legitimate maintenance records, we can't know. Which is the point, Mason said. Which is the point, she agreed. The whole fraud was built on the gap between what something looks like and what its actual history is. These components look fine. They might even be fine in most cases, but you can't know because the paper that's supposed to tell you doesn't mean anything. Mason looked at the blade, at the way the light hit the composite surface, at the 2 sections Dabrowski had marked with tape. In maintenance, he said, you trust the records or you trust the physical inspection, ideally both. When you have neither, you ground the aircraft, Dabrowski said. You ground the aircraft, he agreed. That afternoon, the board met at Sterling Aero Group. Mason wasn't there. He had no part in it, no standing, no role. He heard about it from Priya, who was apparently constitutionally incapable of not calling him with updates. She presented for 45 minutes, Priya said. I don't know what she said. I wasn't in the room. But Gerald Foster voted with her, 6-3. Mason let out a breath. She stays. She stays. A pause. Mr. Ryder, I've worked for a lot of people. I've seen a lot of moments like this. She's different than she was a week ago. I don't know how to explain it exactly. I know what you mean, he said. After Priya hung up, he sat with the information for a moment. Not triumphant, not relieved in any dramatic sense, just settled. The way things settle when the right outcome happens and you're tired enough that the pleasure of it is quiet rather than loud. He sent a text to Rex. She kept the seat, 6-3. Rex replied, smart board. Then after a moment, go home soon. Your kid misses you. He looked at the text. He thought about Lily's poster board with the plant drawings, about Sergeant the Rabbit, about the lopsided ponytail in Deb's photo. He walked back into Hangar 4 and stood next to the H-175 one more time, the aircraft that had started all of this. He walked around it slowly, the way he'd walked around it the first day he'd seen it, except that day it had been broken and uncertain, and now it was neither. He put his hand on the tail boom. The metal was cool and solid. He'd brought it back from nothing. That was still true, regardless of everything else. Regardless of the fraud, the investigation, the board vote, the $15 million, the 70 aircraft across 3 states. Regardless of the torn invoice and the sealed envelope and the 4 months he'd spent a long way from his daughter. He'd been hired to fix a helicopter. He'd fixed it. And then he'd done the rest, because the rest was what needed doing. He didn't know how to be a different kind of person than that. He'd tried to figure it out a few times over the years and concluded it wasn't worth the effort. He went back to the hotel and started packing. He had a science project to look at and a kid to get home to, and the rest of it would still be here when it needed him. He made it home on February 28th, 3 days before Lily's science project was due. She was watching from Deb's front window when he pulled into the driveway, and by the time he had the car in park, she was already through the front door and across the lawn in her socks, which she was not supposed to wear outside. And he caught her mid-leap the way he'd been catching her since she was 4 years old and had decided that the appropriate way to greet her father was as a projectile. She was heavier than the last time. Kids got heavier in ways you didn't notice until you were holding them after 5 weeks away. He held on longer than usual. She let him. Your socks are going to be soaked, he said into her hair. I don't care, she said. Deb's going to make you change them. I still don't care. He set her down and looked at her. She'd gotten a haircut at some point. The ends were even in a way they hadn't been when he dropped her off, which meant Deb had taken her somewhere, which meant Lily had probably submitted to it with the theatrical suffering she applied to all personal grooming. But she looked like herself. She looked healthy and bright-eyed and slightly wild in the way she always was. And he felt something in his chest that he'd been keeping compressed for 5 weeks release itself all at once. Come see the project, she said immediately, grabbing his hand and pulling. Let me get my bag. After. Come see the project first. He let himself be pulled. The science project was on the kitchen table. It was genuinely impressive. A trifold poster board with organized sections for hypothesis, methodology, results, and conclusion, plant samples in labeled cups arranged in order of soil type, a hand-drawn graph that was not perfectly to scale, but showed real understanding of what it was measuring. Lily had tested 4 types of soil over 3 weeks, and the basil seedlings in the organic potting mix had grown measurably faster than the others, which was not a surprising result, but was a correctly executed experiment, and the poster said so without overclaiming. This is really good, Lil, he said, and he meant it. She stood next to him with her arms crossed, trying not to look too pleased with herself and failing. Deb helped with the graph. But you did the measurements every day. Every day, even on the days I didn't want to. He looked at her. That's the most important part, showing up on the days you don't want to. She made a face like she wasn't sure if he was talking about the science project anymore. She was 9, not 6. She caught things. Is that what you were doing in Houston, she said? Showing up on the days you didn't want to? He thought about the hotel room, about the bad coffee and the adequate Thai food and the basketball games he hadn't watched, about the maintenance records and the component numbers and the slow grinding work of building documentation that meant something. Yeah, he said, something like that. She nodded, like that made sense to her, and went to find her socks. He stayed at Deb's for dinner. His sister had made her standard response to any significant life event, which was a pot of chili large enough to feed 8 people and a pan of cornbread that was genuinely the best cornbread Mason had ever eaten, and that Deb refused to give the recipe for on the grounds that it was the only thing she reliably had over him. They ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, biscuit underneath, hoping for something to fall. Lily talked for most of the meal. She'd been storing things up, apparently. Observations about the dog, opinions about her teacher's grading, a complicated social situation at school involving a disagreement over whose turn it was to be team captain during PE that had diplomatic implications Mason needed several minutes to fully understand. He listened to all of it. He asked questions. He felt the specific pleasure of a parent who has been away long enough to genuinely appreciate the ordinary texture of his kid's life, rather than taking it for granted. After Lily went to bed, Deb poured 2 glasses of wine and sat across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him the way older sisters look at younger brothers when they've been worried and are now deciding how much to say about it. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah." "Really okay?" or "I'm not going to talk about it okay?" Somewhere in between. He looked at his wine glass. "It was a hard few months, but I think it's going to be okay." "I read the articles," she said. "Some of them. The ones about the grounded helicopters and the fraud investigation." She paused. "Your name wasn't in any of them. I asked to be kept out of the public reporting. But you were the one who found it. I was the one who fixed a helicopter and paid attention while I was doing it." Deb gave him a look that said she understood the distinction he was drawing and was not entirely letting him get away with it. "Mason, 70 aircraft. You want to tell me that's just paying attention?" He thought about the first component number, about writing it in the black notebook, about how small it had been. "It always starts with something small," he said. "You notice the small thing, then you notice the next small thing. Then at some point you have enough small things that you can see the big thing they're part of." He paused. "It's not complicated. It just requires not looking away." Deb was quiet for a moment. "A lot of people look away." "Yeah," he said. "They do." She refilled his glass without asking. They sat there for a while in the comfortable way of people who have known each other their whole lives and can be quiet together without it meaning anything except that they're tired and okay and glad to be in the same room. He drove home to his own apartment that night, not because he wasn't welcome at Deb's, but because he'd been in hotel rooms for 5 weeks, and he needed to sleep in his own bed with the particular sounds of his own building around him. The upstairs neighbor who walked heavily, the radiator that knocked in cold weather, the specific quality of streetlight through his bedroom curtains that he'd been looking at for 4 years. He lay in the dark for a while before he fell asleep, not thinking about anything in particular, just present, just home. He slept 9 hours. He hadn't slept 9 hours straight since before Lily was born. The science project got a 91. Mrs. Patterson took 2 points off for the graph scaling and gave back 7 for what she called exceptional experimental discipline in the daily measurement log, which Lily had maintained without missing a day. Lily considered this a moral victory and spent the drive home from school explaining to Mason exactly why the graph scaling deduction was philosophically unfair. He listened and made appropriate noises and privately agreed with Mrs. Patterson but said nothing. That was parenting. Some things you keep to yourself. In the first weeks of March, Mason settled back into his regular work. The Phoenix Medevac Bell 407 that had been waiting patiently in his shop for his return, a routine inspection on a news helicopter out of Austin, a turbine replacement that kept him busy for a week. Regular work. The kind of work that didn't have federal investigators or sealed envelopes or the weight of knowing what was at stake if you got it wrong in a specific, identifiable way. He also had phone calls to return. The FAA's legal office called twice about his forthcoming deposition in the fraud case. His own attorney, he'd finally gotten one, at Rex's insistence, a woman named Kaminsky who specialized in aviation law and had the brisk, skeptical efficiency of someone who had seen every variety of institutional mess, walked him through what to expect and reminded him 3 times to answer only what was asked and not to volunteer additional context. He was going to be a difficult opponent, she said, not because he was uncooperative, but because he knew too much and had the documentation to back all of it up, and the defense attorneys were going to have a very uncomfortable time trying to undermine him. That's not a problem, he said. It's not a problem for our side, Kaminsky said. It may make the process longer. I'm fine with longer if it means accurate. She made a sound that suggested she'd been doing this long enough to have stopped being surprised by clients who prioritized accuracy over expedience, but that it still struck her as mildly unusual. The deposition happened on a Tuesday in late March at a law office in downtown Houston. Mason drove down the night before, stayed at a different hotel than the one he'd lived in during the restoration. He'd had enough of that parking lot, and showed up the following morning in the same clean, dark clothing he wore when he needed to look like someone who had his act together. He sat across from 3 defense attorneys and answered questions for 6.5 hours. He answered them the same way he documented his work, accurately, completely, without embellishment, without minimizing. When he didn't know something, he said he didn't know. When he knew something, he said it plainly, and when asked, explained the technical basis for his knowledge in terms that were clear and not condescending, which was a balance he'd been striking his entire career. He referred to his documentation 87 times. He knew the number because Kaminsky counted. At the end of the day, one of the defense attorneys, a young man who'd spent most of the afternoon trying to find gaps in Mason's methodology, asked if he could see one particular photograph from Mason's documentation file for the 3rd time. Mason slid it across the table without comment. The attorney looked at it for a moment, then set it down. No further questions, he said. Kaminsky bought him dinner that evening at a steakhouse near the hotel and did not talk about the deposition for the first 30 minutes, which he appreciated. You're a good witness, she said eventually. I just told the truth. You told the truth in a way that was comprehensible and consistent and backed up at every point by physical documentation. That's not as common as you'd think. She cut a piece of steak. Dennis Cahill's attorneys are going to have a very bad spring. What's the likely outcome? For Cahill? Federal fraud charges, FAA certification violations, conspiracy. He's looking at significant prison time if it goes to trial. His attorney's probably already working on a cooperation agreement. She paused. The people above him, the ones who built the apex structure, the supply chain, that investigation is still expanding. The national office has identified a network that goes through 3 states and 2 countries for parts sourcing. This is going to run for another 2 years at minimum. Mason thought about that, about the scope of what had started from one wrong number. The mechanics, he said. The ones Victoria Sterling kept on. Are they going to face anything? The 3 who cooperated actively are part of the federal case. The others, Kaminsky shook her head. Probably not criminal exposure, absent new evidence. They were handed falsified documentation and told to sign. Proving they knew it was false is a different bar. Good, he said. She looked at him. You actually mean that? I worked with guys who signed things they shouldn't have signed because somebody above them made it very clear what happened to people who asked too many questions. That's not the same as being the person running the fraud. She studied him for a moment with the assessing look of someone who spent her days with people in complicated situations and was taking his measure. You would have been a good lawyer, she said. I'm a better mechanic. She smiled at that, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Yes, you probably are. He drove back to San Antonio the next morning and went straight to his shop, where the medevac bell was waiting with the patience of inanimate objects, and the Phoenix company's operations manager had called twice asking for an update. He called back, confirmed a timeline, and went to work. That was March. In April, Victoria Sterling called him. It had been 6 weeks since the board vote. The investigation was ongoing, the fleet was still grounded, and Sterling Aero Group had become substantially smaller in the interim. They'd had to let go of 11 non-maintenance employees and renegotiate 2 of their major client contracts to something more modest, while the fleet was out of service. The merger Victoria had been trying to close when all of this started had collapsed in February. A casualty of the investigation's timing, and the company that had been her acquisition target had ultimately partnered with one of Sterling's competitors instead. Mason had followed all of this at a distance, the way you follow news about a place you've been when you no longer live there. "I owe you an update," she said when he answered. "You don't owe me anything. The invoice was paid 6 weeks ago. The legal piece is handled. The rest?" She paused. "I want to keep you informed because you're part of why there's still a company to give updates about." He was quiet. He'd heard versions of that sentiment before and hadn't known how to receive it then either. "How's it going?" he said. "Slowly. Everything is slowly." She sounded different than she had in Houston. Not worse exactly, but more worn in, like someone who had spent 2 months doing the actual work of accountability rather than just deciding to do it. There was less of the controlled CEO composure and more of just her voice. The FAA has completed preliminary inspections on 9 of the 12 grounded aircraft. 7 are cleared for restoration work. 2 have damage that's significant enough that the repair cost exceeds replacement value. Which 2? She named them. He thought about them, where they'd sat in the hangar, what he knew about their maintenance history from the records he'd reviewed. He wasn't surprised by either. "Are you replacing them?" "Yes. Smaller models. We're scaling back the fleet size. 12 aircraft was too much for where we actually were as a company. 8 is more honest." She paused. That was hard to say to the board. It's still hard. "But you said it." "I said it." A brief pause. "Mason, the offer I made you in February, the oversight role, is that still something you're considering?" He'd been thinking about it intermittently for 6 weeks, turning it over the way he turned over most significant decisions, not obsessively, but consistently. Picking it up, looking at it from different angles, setting it down, letting it sit. He thought about what it would mean practically. He'd need to keep his independent business. He wasn't willing to give that up. The medevac companies and the news helicopters and the small operators who called him because their aircraft was broken, and he had a reputation for fixing broken aircraft. He wasn't going to be a single company employee. But a consulting oversight arrangement structured correctly with the independence terms she'd described, that was a different thing. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "And?" "I have conditions." "I expected you would." "The safety independence can't just be written into a contract. It has to be structural, a safety committee that I report to independently of the operations chain, with authority that can't be overridden by commercial timelines, not just a policy, an actual governance structure." "Agreed." "Any mechanic in the fleet has the unilateral right to ground an aircraft pending inspection. No consequences for grounding. The only thing that gets you fired is clearing an aircraft you shouldn't have cleared." "Agreed." "Full documentation access. Everything. Procurement, maintenance records, supplier certifications. Real-time access, not summary reports." "Agreed." He paused. "Victoria, I'm not going to be someone who just signs off on things. If I find something, I'm going to say so. And if I say so and nothing happens, I'm going to report it to the FAA myself." "I know," she said. "That's why I want you." He thought about that for a moment, about the difference between an organization that hired someone like him to cover itself and one that hired someone like him because it actually wanted the thing he provided. "One more thing," he said. "Rex Whitmore. I want him contracted as an independent compliance auditor, quarterly reviews of the entire maintenance system. He reports to the safety committee, not to operations." A pause. "Is that necessary? Do you want me to trust that the system is working, or do you want to build a system that's actually trustworthy?" A longer pause. "Send me Rex's contact information," she said. He sent it that afternoon. The contract was finalized in May. Kaminsky negotiated it, which meant it was thorough enough that neither side was going to find surprises in it 2 years from now. Mason signed it at his shop desk on a Thursday evening after Lily had gone to bed. The shop quiet around him. The Bell he was currently working on sitting in the bay with its engine cover open like a patient waiting for its appointment. He looked at the signed contract for a moment. He thought about October, about a phone call from a woman with a sharp voice and an impossible deadline, about the H-175 sitting in a hangar with blue tape everywhere and the particular smell of a fire that hadn't been forgotten, About one wrong number on one component on one hydraulic pressure sensor. He thought about the sealed envelope. About 24 hours. He thought about Lily at the airport, holding Sergeant the Rabbit and looking back twice. He filed the contract in the cabinet where he kept signed contracts and went to bed. The fleet restoration began in June. Mason drove to Houston every third week for the first 2 months, and then as the work found its rhythm and the team Sterling had brought in proved capable of operating under the new documentation standards, once a month. He inspected every aircraft before it returned to service. He signed every clearance himself, personally, with his own certification number, on work he had personally verified. He was slow. He was thorough. He was, by the assessment of the Sterling operations manager, approximately 40% more conservative in his clearance standards than anyone they'd worked with before. He took that as accurate information delivered with the wrong tone. If 40% more conservative means the aircraft we clear are actually airworthy, he said, at a meeting with the operations team in August, then that's the right number. If you want a faster number, you need a different safety officer. The operations manager, a man named Torres who had come in as part of Victoria's post-investigation reorganization and who was still calibrating what the new culture of the company actually meant in practice, looked at him for a moment. "I'm not asking you to change the number," Torres said carefully. "I'm noting it as context for our operational timeline." "Noted," Mason said, "and I'm noting that the operational timeline doesn't affect the clearance standard." They understood each other after that. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was honest, and Mason had learned over the years that honest discomfort was more functional than comfortable dishonesty in situations where the stakes were real. Rex's first quarterly audit happened in September. He spent 4 days at the facility, reviewed 212 maintenance records, interviewed 9 mechanics, and submitted a report that was 53 pages long and found 3 items requiring corrective action. None of them serious, all of them the kind of early-stage procedural drift that becomes serious if you don't catch it before it becomes a habit. Mason read the report the evening Rex sent it. He called Rex afterward. 3 items, he said. 3 items? Rex confirmed. 2 of them are documentation shortcuts that aren't unsafe yet, but could become unsafe. The third is a supplier verification step that's being completed after the fact instead of before parts are installed. I'll address all 3 with Torres. The supplier one especially. That's how it starts, Mason. You verify after instead of before once, twice, it becomes the norm. And then one day you're verifying after installation and the part is already in the aircraft. I know you know. Rex paused. The team is good, though. Genuinely. The mechanics who are left, the ones who went through retraining, they're more careful than they were. You can see it in how they document. They're not documenting because they're told to. They're documenting because they understand why it matters. Mason thought about that. About the difference between compliance and understanding. About how a culture that had been built on pressure and shortcuts didn't transform overnight, but did apparently transform. Slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, in some areas, but genuinely in the ones that mattered most. "How much longer do you think it takes?" he said. "For what?" "For it to be real. Not performed. Actually real." Rex was quiet for a moment. "Ask me in another year, but if you're asking whether I think it's heading in the right direction..." Another pause. "Yeah, I do." Mason sat with that. Dennis Cahill pleaded guilty in October to federal fraud charges and 3 counts of FAA certification violations. He received a sentence of 6 years in federal prison and a permanent lifetime ban from the aviation industry. 2 of the 3 mechanics who had actively cooperated with the fraud scheme received sentences of 18 months and 2 years respectively, with the 3rd receiving a deferred sentence in exchange for cooperation with the broader investigation into the Apex Aviation Supply Network. The investigation into that network, the people who had built Apex and the Louisiana Shell facility, and what turned out to be a third front company operating out of Nevada, continued. It was going to continue for a while. Mason followed it the way you follow a long-running story you were once at the center of, with interest but from a distance, the way you watch weather after you've come inside. The person at the center of the Apex network turned out to be a former aviation industry executive named Grantham. who had been quietly building the supply chain for 4 years, identifying operators under financial pressure and offering them a discount parts solution that looked legitimate enough to pass casual scrutiny and cheap enough to be attractive when margins were tight. 3 operators had knowingly bought from Apex. Others, like Sterling, had been sold the parts through intermediaries who were themselves sold falsified documentation. Grantham was arrested in November in a different state entirely, having apparently not understood until it was too late how thoroughly the thread had been followed. Mason read about the arrest online while he was eating lunch at his shop. He noted it. He went back to work. The 8th helicopter in Victoria Sterling's restored fleet was cleared for service in early December. That left 1 aircraft in the restoration queue, the H-175. It had been last in line not because it needed the most work, but because Mason had requested it that way. He'd wanted every other aircraft completed and certified before he signed off on the one he'd rebuilt from the ground up, the one that had started everything, the one that contained 4 months of his life in every repaired joint and replaced component. He drove to Houston for the final inspection in the second week of December. The H-175 was in Hangar 4, same as always. Someone had cleaned the hangar floor. It was cleaner than he'd ever seen it, actually, which made him think Victoria had orchestrated this slightly, made it a moment, and he felt both the slight awkwardness of that and also something he couldn't dismiss as undeserved. He walked around the aircraft alone first, taking his time, doing the inspection he'd done dozens of times with this specific machine, checking the things he'd checked before, and the things that were new, and the things that were fundamentally the same as the day he'd first found them and corrected them. It took 2 hours. When he was done, he stood next to the aircraft and looked at it for a while. There was a thing that happened sometimes at the end of a long, complicated job, a feeling he'd never quite found words for. Not pride exactly, or not just pride, more like a kind of settling. The sense of a closed circuit, of energy that had been moving in a particular direction, finally arriving at the place it was always going. He opened his notebook, the same brand of black moleskin, a new one, the previous ones filling a shelf in his shop, and wrote the final entry for the H-175. Component status, verified. Documentation, complete. Aircraft status, airworthy. He signed it with his certification number, his real one. The one he'd earned over 20 years of doing this work the way it was supposed to be done. Victoria Sterling arrived at 11, with Torres and 2 of the senior mechanics from the restoration team. She didn't make a speech. He appreciated that about her. She'd learned, somewhere in the past 10 months, that the moments that meant something didn't need framing. She walked up and stood next to him in front of the H-175. "All 8, she said. "All 8. She looked at the aircraft. "I owe you an apology." "You've apologized." "Not specifically enough." She turned to look at him. "I tore your invoice in half, in front of your face, in a room full of people. I had you escorted out of the building by security." She said it flat, without softening it. It wasn't just a business dispute. It was a statement about how I saw you, and how I saw you was wrong. He considered that. "You were under pressure and you trusted the wrong people." "Yes, and I chose to trust them partly because trusting them was easier than asking the harder questions." She paused. "You asked the harder questions. For 4 months, quietly, by yourself, in our hangar, while nobody was paying attention. And then you put the evidence in an envelope and gave me 24 hours instead of going straight to the FAA. You deserved the chance to handle it yourself first." "I know." She looked back at the aircraft. "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I've seen what happens when a problem goes straight to external authority before the person responsible has any chance to respond to it. Sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes it just bypasses the chance for someone to choose to do the right thing." He paused. "You seemed like someone who might choose right if you were given actual information instead of what you'd been given." That was a significant bet to make on someone you'd only known for a few months. "Yeah," he said. It was. They stood there in the hangar, the H-175 between them, and the winter light coming through the high windows, and it was not a perfect moment. There were mechanics in the background working on something, and somewhere outside a vehicle was running, and the fluorescent light in the far corner of the hangar was still flickering. Nobody had fixed it, but it was a real one. The company's smaller, she said. 8 aircraft instead of 12. 12 employees fewer than we had in January. The merger is gone. A pause. I keep thinking about whether I rebuilt the right thing, whether I should have just let it go, liquidated, started something different. What do you think? I think if I'd walked away, the people who worked here and still work here would have lost their jobs to somebody else's fraud. And I think the thing that was actually good about this company, the client relationships, the operational knowledge, the mechanics who stayed and retrained and are doing better work now than they were before, none of that would exist anymore. She paused. I also think I stayed partly out of stubbornness. I don't know how to fully separate those things. Most honest things you can't fully separate, he said. She looked at him. Is that from something? No, it's just true. She almost smiled, almost. I'm going to be a long time earning back what this company lost. Probably, he said. That's usually how it goes. Does it bother you, being involved with something that's still incomplete? Still in the middle of earning its way back? He thought about it. The best maintenance relationships I've ever had are with operators who are honest about what they don't know and keep showing me the truth of how their machines are running. Not the ones who have everything together, the ones who respect the work enough to not lie about it. He looked at her. That's where you are. You're not fixed, but you're not lying about it. She nodded. Something settled in her expression that had been unsettled for a long time. The invoice, she said. The interest. The damages. Was that enough? It was more than enough. Good. She paused. There's one more thing. She handed him an envelope. He opened it. It was a formal document on FAA letterhead, confirming the correction of the fraudulent maintenance records that had carried his certification number. 14 records, formally expunged, with a letter of record from the FAA, certifying that the certifications had been fraudulently attributed and that Mason Ryder's professional record remained clean and unimpeachable. He looked at it for a long moment. He hadn't let himself think about how much that had been sitting on him. The weight of his name on records he hadn't made, the quiet wrong of his professional identity being used for something he hadn't done. He'd held it at a distance because there was too much else to do, and now it was resolved and the holding at a distance dissolved all at once. The FAA sent it last week, she said. I wanted to give it to you here. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Thank you, he said. He said it simply, and she received it simply, and that was the right way for it to happen. They cleared the H-175 for service that afternoon. Mason signed the documentation. Torres filed it with operations. The aircraft that had started everything. The helicopter every major repair center had declared beyond saving. The one he'd spent 4 months rebuilding in a Houston hangar while a criminal operation ran through the company around him, was officially, formally, unreservedly airworthy. After, Victoria had asked if he wanted to be there for the first flight. He'd said yes, and he meant it. The test flight was scheduled for late afternoon. The pilot, a woman named Coelho, who had been with Sterling for 3 years and had a reputation for being exactly the kind of careful that the job required, walked Mason through her pre-flight checks without being asked, which told him something about the culture shift in a way that no policy document could. She wasn't performing thoroughness for his benefit. She was just thorough. The helicopter lifted just before 5 o'clock. The evening sky was clear, the light the particular gold that December evenings get in Texas when there's no weather coming, and the air has gone cool and still. The H-175 rose from the pad with the clean, settled authority of an aircraft that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Rotors beating at a frequency that Mason recognized in his chest, the way you recognize music you've been hearing your whole life. He stood on the tarmac and watched it go. Victoria was beside him. Torres was a few feet back. The 2 senior mechanics from the restoration team were there too, standing a little apart, watching with the specific attention of people who had done the physical work and were watching it fly. The helicopter rose and turned east and became smaller against the gold sky, and then was just a shape, and then was a sound, and then was gone. Mason was quiet for a while. He thought about the things you couldn't fully explain to people who hadn't done this kind of work. The relationship between a mechanic and an aircraft he'd rebuilt, the way it wasn't quite like other professional satisfactions. The way it carried in it the knowledge of everything that was wrong and everything you did to make it right, all compressed into the moment when the thing you fixed becomes airborne and keeps going. He thought about Lily's science project, about the daily measurement log she'd maintained without missing a day, about showing up on the days you don't want to. He thought about a wrong number on a hydraulic pressure sensor, small enough to miss, and the choice to write it down. He thought about trust, how it was built, how it was broken, how it was different from forgiveness, how it required actions over time rather than declarations at moments, how a company could be smaller and less profitable and more honest than it was before, and that could be a better outcome than the alternative. How a person could tear an invoice in half and later hand you a letter that cleared your name, and both of those things could be true about the same person. He thought about the fact that nobody in this story was entirely one thing. Not Cahill, who had built something corrupt but had also spent 23 years in an industry he clearly understood. Not the mechanics who'd signed things they shouldn't have, some of whom had known and some of whom hadn't, and most of whom were somewhere complicated in between. Not Victoria, who had driven her company too hard and trusted the wrong people, and then written the truest press release he'd ever read, and spent 10 months doing the actual work of making it mean something. Not himself, not entirely right, not entirely wrong, sometimes stubborn in ways that weren't only virtuous, sometimes more certain than he had any right to be, carrying his own damage from his own history into every room he walked into. Nobody in this story was clean. They were all just people trying to do the right thing at varying success rates, with varying information, under varying degrees of pressure. What mattered was what you did when the pressure was highest, and the information was most incomplete, and the right thing was least convenient. That was the question. It was always the question. He'd answered it by writing things down, by not looking away from the small wrongness, by putting evidence in an envelope and giving someone the chance to choose. Victoria had answered it by writing a statement her board hated, and her lawyers aged over, and the journalism industry noticed. The mechanics in retraining had answered it by coming back every day and doing the work correctly when they could have resented being asked to. None of those answers had been easy. None of them had been clean. None of them had resolved things quickly or without significant cost. But here was an aircraft flying east in the December light, safe, certified, carried by systems that someone had actually checked, and that was not a small thing. That was not nothing. Behind him, he heard one of the mechanics say something to the other, too low to make out, and the other one laughed. Beside him, Victoria Sterling watched the sky where the helicopter had been. "It's a good aircraft," she said. "It is now," he said. She turned to look at him. "Was that a joke?" "Little bit." She shook her head, and this time she did smile, fully, and it changed her face in a way he hadn't seen before, made her look younger and more tired, and more human than the version of herself she'd been presenting in conference rooms for the past year. "Get home to your daughter," she said. "I was going to." He drove to the airport. He was on a 7:15 flight to San Antonio. He had a window seat he didn't particularly need but had selected out of the habit of someone who'd spent enough time in aircraft to prefer knowing where the wing was. He sat in the terminal with a coffee that was mediocre at best and his notebook open to a blank page. And he wrote a few things down. Not work things, not documentation, just thoughts. He'd never been much of a journal keeper, but sometimes at the end of something long and complicated, he found it useful to put words to what he'd been through, less for posterity than for the practical purpose of understanding what he now knew that he hadn't known before. He wrote, "The documentation is the job, always, not a separate thing from the work. Not a formality after the fact, the same thing." He wrote, "Trust is not forgiveness. Trust takes longer. That's appropriate." He wrote, "Most things start small. Most things that matter start so small that most people don't notice them. That's not an argument for being suspicious of everything. It's an argument for paying attention." He looked at what he'd written. Then he wrote one more thing. Lily's project, daily measurements, showing up on the days you don't want to. He closed the notebook. On the flight home, somewhere over the dark Texas landscape between Houston and San Antonio, Mason Ryder sat in his window seat and watched the lights below, and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in a long time. Just the lights, just the altitude, Just the simple, enormous fact of being in an aircraft that was working the way it was supposed to, carrying him home. Lily was already in bed when he got in, but she'd left a note on the kitchen counter in her handwriting, which was large and definitive and used more exclamation points than the situation typically warranted. It said, "Dad? Sergeant says, welcome home. I kept your dinner in the fridge. Don't forget, tomorrow is Taco Tuesday. It is not optional. Love, Lily." He stood in his kitchen in his jacket, travel bag still on his shoulder, and read the note twice. Then he put it on the refrigerator with a magnet. He heated the dinner she'd left, pasta, nothing complicated, Deb must have taught her, and ate it standing at the counter in the quiet of his own apartment, and it was the best meal he'd had in months. Not because of what it was, because of who left it. He washed the dish, turned off the light, and went to check on her. She was asleep, Sergeant tucked under one arm, the blanket pulled up in the haphazard way she slept, not entirely covered, one foot out. The nightlight made the room amber and warm. On her desk, the science project poster board was folded up with a rubber band around it, the 91 written on the front in red marker. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he pulled her blanket up, tucked the edge in the way she'd always liked without knowing why she liked it, and went to bed. Outside, the night was quiet. Somewhere east of the city, an H-175 was in a hangar, grounded until its next scheduled flight, resting the way things rest between the times they're needed. It was going to fly again tomorrow. So was he.